Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the regular scheduled meeting of the San Francisco Ethics Commission for June 27, 2016. I'll call the roll. Commissioner Keene. Here. Commissioner Hain.
Here.
Commissioner Chu.
Here.
All are present and accounted for. Turning to item 2, public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda. And I would, as we have a fairly long agenda, which I anticipate comments, hopefully the comments will be limited to something other than that's on the agenda. Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Charles Marsteller with Friends of Ethics. We've been in discussions with Board President on the question of the whistleblower amendment. They've asked for some guidance from, in our opinion, on how to organize the hearing. So I will send the Commission Executive Director a brief memo on that so that she'll see what we've suggested to Commission or Board of I have to warm up here, Ms. Breed and her staff, and they were actually talking about generating a bit of a crowd, or at least notifying the public in general, which we can amply do for you, but you have your own contacts list as well. But there was some thought by the board that this should attract some interest on the part of labor and city employee groups. So that's what our thought was. So I did want to let you know if anything comes up that we need to bring it up with you or bring back to you, we will.
Thank you.
Members of the Ethics Commission, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. Whether you're aware of it or not, the complaint I filed with this commission in May has already been dismissed. The one I filed, actually in April, was already been dismissed. The one I filed in May was investigated for 2 whole days before they dismissed it. And it was done by Catherine Argumetto, who is the person I told you when I went to in November, tried to dissuade me from filing the complaints in the first place. And so I think she was totally prejudiced against them, and there's no impartiality whatsoever. The so-called investigations are something I completely understand. The sole purpose was to dismiss the complaints and deny me a public hearing. A public hearing would result in serious consequences for both Supervisor Mark Farrell and the San Francisco Public Library, in particular, Luis Herrera, the city librarian. As far as Mark Farrell goes, you know very well that he would never have shown up to a hearing. Bad looking for you, certainly. In fact, he probably would have thumbed his nose at you, just as he did to the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, in not even sending someone to their hearings. While embarrassing for you, it would be very instructive to the citizens of San Francisco that while you may be able to bully non-city persons or groups, city agencies treat you as the joke you are. Neither the mayor, the Board of Supervisors, or any city agency would even deign to reply to your findings, let alone enforce them. This body is a meaningless farce. When you voted unanimously to remove Jewel Gomez as the president of the Library Commission, the mayor ignored you. When you sent a letter to him a year later asking what was the result of your recommendation, he ignored you. So you were fully aware of the fact that you were absolutely powerless. There's an old Southern expression, and that expression is useless as tits on a boar hog. And basically, that's what this has come to. You have been here during the entire time all this corruption has erupted in San Francisco, and the lack of action on your part related to any city officials is part and parcel of why this city has turned into a cesspool.
Thank you. All right, item 3, and we have reversed the order where it usually is. Item 3 is the discussion and possible action on draft minutes for the Commission's May 23rd, 2016 regular meeting. Any of the Commissioners have any comments or corrections to the minutes? Any public comments?
this agenda item 4?
We haven't gotten to item 4 yet.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Because I have a hearing issue.
No, 3. Yeah.
Sorry.
On page 6, it refers to my invitation to Supervisor Farrell to appear before the commission. I think you might want to correct the wording to indicate that the commission had been encouraging the supervisor to appear before the commission. It's obviously not my discretion to do so. But I was pointing out my frustration with the fact that to date he had not appeared.
Right. Any other corrections?
Commissioners Rayhartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. I would like anybody in this room or watching on SFT TV reviewing these minutes to notice that I am the only citizen in San Francisco whose constitutionally protected political free speech actually makes it into the minutes in any meaningful fashion. In Citizens United, the Supreme Court wrote, "By taking the right to speak from some and giving it to others, the government deprives the disadvantaged person or class of the right to use speech to strive to establish worth, standing, and respect for the speaker's voice. The government may not by these means deprive the public of the right and privilege to determine for itself without what speech and speakers are worthy of consideration. The First Amendment protects speech and speaker and the ideas that flow therefrom. This body is desirous of producing an Orwellian 1984 Newspeak record with comments from other speakers, especially those voicing criticism, being reduced to meaningless misrepresentations. You should be ashamed. I had to fight for 4 years to get these 150-word summaries into the minutes because I was tired of having people bastardize and mischaracterize and downright lie about what I said at public comment. This is constitutionally protected free speech. These people's, mine, yours, anybody else's. And the fact that you want to have a really good-looking record that makes you look like you're nothing but good people who do nothing but good, and you want to keep anything negative out of it, which is a direct violation of the Sunshine Ordinance, which you have a legal obligation to enforce, is unconscionable. There's an old expression, it's hard to explain a man that he should understand something when not understanding it is the basis of him keeping his job.
Do you have any corrections to the minutes? Right. Do I hear a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion is carried unanimously and the minutes are approved with the correction noted by one of the speakers. Turning to item 4, discussion and possible action including potential waiver of attorney-client privilege regarding Public Records Act request for the audio recording of Ethics Commission closed session held on June 23rd, 2014 regarding agenda item 6. And I believe that the request was made by Mr. Grossman, and I will give you 3 minutes to hear what...
All of 3 minutes. How exciting.
I don't think it'll take you that long, will it?
Well, with only 3 minutes for my comments, I won't repeat most of what's in my memorandum. Hopefully you've all read it and considered how much you have to ponder. The facts are pretty clear. For a year and a half, both the former executive director and the city attorney hijacked and kept secret from the commission a legally required open process. They intentionally provoked a lawsuit, mine, which they defended and appealed without commission authorization until it reached the appellate court, at which point there was no turning back. So it was only then, after this year and a half of all this activity, including 4 hearings before the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, that there was a single 55-minute closed session regarding 3 agenda agenda items, including the one at issue here. Following which, the commissioners voted to keep the city attorney's advice secret, whatever that was, which meant they decided to keep secret their views on litigation whose defense and appeal they never authorized with regard to records they had never seen. The 1999 Sunshine Ordinance was on the ballot by a voters' initiative and was adopted by the same majority vote as required for a charter amendment. California citizens' public access rights to their government's records and meetings are constitutionally guaranteed. So now this commission is at another crossroad. Does it continue to violate its own bylaws? Does it continue to undermine its role as a charter-designated enforcement body for public access? And whose interest is it really protecting? The former executive director, the city attorney, or possibly some of the commissioners? California's public policy is that this is the public's best interest, these disclosures. At law school, I was taught and still believe if there's a relevant statute, that's where you go first to analyze a legal issue. Here, the Sunshine Ordinance is absolutely clear on the two legal issues presented. Did the status of the existing litigation on June 23, 24 satisfy the requirements of Section 6710D? If it did not, for the reasons stated in my for the reasons stated in my memorandum, has the passage of time obviated any need to keep the audio recording secret per Section 67-8.1A? The answer is yes, as my memorandum demonstrates. I actually have some further thoughts, but 3 minutes is kind of limiting.
Thank you. All right. Does staff have any comments, or the city attorney have any comments on this request? Any discussion among the commissioners? Is there a motion to grant Mr. Grossman's request for a copy of the transcript? I have no objection, frankly, to the transcript being released. But when the question first came up, I said it's a commission decision, not mine.
I guess my question is, why are we still dealing with this? Oh, I'm sorry. My question is, after all this time, and including the litigation, why are we still dealing with this? Other than that, if Mr. Grossman wants, a record of the hearing, certainly. I don't know that there's anything there that needs to be withheld.
I can answer that. It's a black box. It's been a black box from the first day I submitted my request in October of 2012. We're talking the better part of 4 years here, almost 4 years, and there's been no meeting at which there was a clear discussion about why it was started, who supported it, whether the city attorney encouraged it, given the city attorney's attitude. There are a lot of reasons why this case is a really bad case. My memo explains it. The city attorney now is free to advise the departments, the commissions, the officials on public record and public meeting matters secretly, and encourage them on how to defeat requests for records or handle meetings that they don't like. I'm sorry.
Does the city attorney have any opinion on this that it wants to share with the commission in regard to Mr. Grossman's request?
Deputy City Attorney Andrew Shen. No, I have nothing else to add. As the staff's memo explains, this is a decision within the commission's discretion.
I move we release the audio recording.
Second.
Any discussion? Let me just clarify for Mr. Grossman. The concern that the commission had was that the decision that was made to assert attorney-client privilege was made by the executive director, which the city attorney had said was properly within his discretion and not a matter for the commission. And in fact, there's an item on tonight's agenda to deal with that very issue because the bylaws are unclear about it. But the transcript will show what the commission was concerned about in the meeting was whether or not we should, as a commission, should have had some participation in the withholding of the documents. Not, you filed a lawsuit and you lost in the appeals court, and it isn't the city attorney who's off on a frolic. It's the Court of Appeals said that the city attorney was correct in its interpretation of the charter. And even though the task force, the Sunshine Task Force, may be unhappy about the fact that attorney-client privilege exists in a records request, that's the law. So, but I have no objection to letting you look at that or letting the public look at the transcript of our discussion.
Thank you. I have some more thoughts, but I'll wait until another time.
All right, any public discussion on the motion?
Members of the Ethics Commission, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. President James Madison wrote the following: "The genius of Republican liberty seems to demand not only that all power should be derived from the people, but that those entrusted with it should be kept independent on the people." Mr. Grossman's request that the body waive the attorney-client privilege and release the recording of the closed session is both reasonable and justified. This body does more to hide its activities from the public than any other whose meetings I have attended. Only through the actions of individual citizens are bodies such as this held to any level of accountability. This body has shown by its behaviors to be totally unwilling and/or unable to enforce open government laws. The very least it can do is disclose to the public, when confidentiality is no longer required, the secret machinations conducted out of the view of the public. Show that you have some sense of integrity. The bottom line is, government is supposed to be held with the participation of and in full view of the public. And you spend so much of your time going back in a back room and having discussions which you expect the public to take just on your word, that have nothing to do with anything that can't be disclosed or shouldn't be disclosed. And I have always had a hard time believing that anybody could go back for 45 minutes or an hour and have a discussion and never say a single thing that couldn't be disclosed. And I think it's disingenuous and deceiving of the public to pretend that there is. Very frankly, I think most of what you want to hide in those conversations is the fact that you're doing something wrong and you don't want the public to know why you're doing it. You're making deals with people like Mark Farrell, the president, the member of the Board of Supervisors who owes you a ton of money. And instead of being open and telling the public what you're doing as you go along, you just stick on this thing. And I think it's because the executive director, the former executive director, handled it so badly that you just don't want to let anybody know how badly you, and by extension they, screwed up.
Mr. Hartz, did you hear what the motion was up here?
Any other public discussion?
Good evening, David Pilpel. Since I'm no longer a member of the task force, I don't think I need to use a disclaimer any further. I'm not sure how I would vote on this motion. I understand from your discussion that you believe that there's information that may be in the public interest to disclose. This is the first time I can recall that there's a request for a closed session tape or information from a closed session that a policy body is considering releasing. So I'm not sure if this would set any sort of precedent. I think this is just a one-time request, but I would just ask you to be very careful and thoughtful about dealing with this request. Generally, closed session matters and discussion are kept between the attorney, the staff, and the members of the policy body. So it's unusual in my experience for such a request to come. And I would just ask you again to be careful about what this means for the city going forward if you choose to make this information available. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Dr. Derek Kerr, a whistleblower. I'm very grateful to Mr. Grossman for his years of public interest litigation in the Sunshine Arena. His request for the closed session records gives you an opportunity to get closer to the public. There's a barrier which is unnecessary and artificial, and this particular recording is one of them. So I hope that you take the opportunity to get closer to us. Thank you.
Any other public comment? I'll call the question. All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion to waive the attorney-client privilege as to the transcript is granted, is passed, and the document will be released to the public. Turning to item number 5, continued discussion and possible action on a proposal regarding a possible November 2016 ballot measure to restrict lobbyist gifts, campaign contribution, and bundling contributions. And I will turn to the staff for their initial discussion.
Okay, good evening, Commissioners. Under item 5 and on the table for the public are the staff memo dated June 22nd and attachments. We took the last month since the Commission's meeting and most recent discussion of the issues to put together a bit more of a legislative record, and also to work with the city attorney on putting together language in an initiative ordinance form so that you could see, consider, discuss the issues, and have the option to act on the proposals if you wanted to this evening. That was something that you had requested last month. There are a number of public comments that were received over the weekend and today. Those are also on the public table and have been provided to you. And I expect that we'll have a fair amount of public comment on the proposals. Just in brief, the memo describes the findings and a recommendation with regard to including some language in the proposal that would speak to the findings that the proposals as an underlying matter address. Also, it would add some language about the ability to amend based on an approach that was taken with Prop C that would allow for the measure to be amended down the road should the Commission feel that that was necessary and that it was in furtherance of the ordinance that is approved. So that would provide some flexibility without having to go back to the voters each time if there is some strengthening or clarifying issues that need to take place. The gift limitation takes a look at restricting, as the proponents have suggested, the gift limits, applying the gift limit more strictly to lobbyists. And the ordinance, or the memo proposes and mirrors in the ordinance language that you have recommendation that lobbyists make no gifts as state law defines that term. That would not change. But it also would include gifts of travel that are currently exempt. So lobbyists would not be permitted to give gifts of travel to officials. And then we have sections on contribution and bundling restrictions and some background both on how the current contribution limits apply and how the proposed language in this approach would apply. There's also some language about alternatives for the Commission to clarify its desire to whether to apply this equally to expenditure lobbyists and contact lobbyists, or whether the commission believes that there should be a carve-out for expenditure lobbyists, for example. But that language is bracketed to provide you with that option. There's also language that brackets the amount of the contribution restriction that's proposed to, on page 9, under recommendation 4. This would create a new aggregate limit on contributions, so that lobbyists could not make contributions that total in excess of either $250, $100, or $50. Those amounts are bracketed for the Commission's consideration. There'll be further input, I'm sure, this evening by those in the audience. And it also takes an approach that would be new, that would include, would count contributions to any and all committees controlled by an officer, and count the contributions that a lobbyist gives to any and all committees of a committee controlled by an officer towards the contribution limit. So it tries to extend the contribution limit concept to those committees where, to the maximum extent under state law, it's possible to do that, to create an aggregate limit for any and all committees controlled by an official. And then lastly, the bundling of contributions under Recommendation 5. This takes an approach that's slightly different from, that's different from the previous discussions as well, and it would prevent lobbyists from transmitting, delivering, or delivering through a third party contributions that are made by another person to a city official. If the total amount of the lobbyist contributions delivered or transmitted made by that lobbyist exceeds the amount of the contribution limit that is to be determined in Recommendation 4. So it would, in essence, permit a lobbyist to bundle some contributions, but at a much lower amount, either half the current contribution amount or lower, and that includes the lobbyist's own contribution. So the lobbyist could give and bundle up to a maximum of the contribution limit that is established under the law under this proposal. That's how this is laid out. And then lastly, there's language under Recommendation 7 that would also provide that the Commission may issue regulations implementing this section and other provisions that are in the measure, but that the regulations would not establish exceptions to the limits or the prohibitions. Again, trying to be very clear that any changes the Commission would, or any regulations the Commission would issue, would need to be in furtherance of supporting strong and clear laws that are there to achieve the goals of the measures as they're proposed. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions for me. Happy to defer to the chair if you'd like to take public comment at this point. Or
first get comments within from the commissioners, and I have a question to the city attorney. Why isn't a safer approach from a constitutional point of view to adopt the approach that the state took, that would say, it would say no contributions can be made by a lobbyist to any individual or office holder, or how we word it, with whom that lobbyist has had contact? In other words, you might say contact in the last year, which would, it clearly is like the state approach, which says we're going to focus on contributions to agencies or agents who the lobbyists are dealing with, as opposed to a lobbyist who may never say contact the planning commission, and you'd say he or she would be free to make contributions to a campaign of a member who might be a commissioner who's running for office or something.
Sure. I think you raise a very good point about a key difference between this provision or this proposal and state law. As you say, state law imposes a similar contribution ban on lobbyists, but only with respect to the officials those state lobbyists are registered to lobby. Whereas here in this proposal, at least it stands right now, a local lobbyist cannot make any contribution to any official, whether or not they're actually lobbied by that person. So thank you for highlighting that key difference. In terms of whether or not it's safer or not, I'm a little bit restricted in terms of speaking in open session about the legal risks and issues raised by this proposal. And I would simply say it's certainly up to the commission and the staff, of course, and their expertise to weigh in on what proposals are worth any legal risks. I think that a narrow approach is almost always, safer from a perspective of facing any legal challenges. So certainly you could go that direction if you want to do so. But again, it's up to the commission and the staff to make to weigh the risks and benefits of going to a broader proposal that maybe, increases legal risk versus a narrow proposal that maybe avoids some of those problems.
I mean, because there is a state Supreme Court that has held that a complete ban of contribution is constitutional so long as it's a focused ban.
Right. Certainly, obviously in the realm of campaign finance and lobbying, the more targeted the limitations are, the more targeted the prohibitions are, the more legally safer it is. But we certainly, again, it's up to the commission staff to weigh those risks and benefits. If it's a more targeted, more narrow proposal, yes, there are some benefits from a legal perspective, but maybe it wouldn't reach some activity that the commissioner staff wishes to reach. So I don't know if Leanne has an additional thought.
Any other comments, commissioners?
I have a question on the bundling. We're talking only about bundling by lobbyists, correct? But are there any regs that exist at this time that would prevent the average citizen from bundling? I mean, certainly anybody can go out and collect checks from all their friends and companions and, go door to door and collect money for a candidate. Why are we not considering a restriction of that nature?
Thank you for the question. I think that the proposal, as it was designed, is trying to focus on where there's the greatest perception or the greatest threat for corruption of the governmental process, because an individual who is a lobbyist who is engaging in activity at the level and regularity and for compensation, for example, that the city law requires them to register at, that the goal is to try and de-link the ability or the prevalence of those individuals from amassing relatively large contributions in a way that could be perceived to be influencing the governmental decisions that they're making.
I understand that.
And so I think that puts it at a different place on the spectrum than a regular citizen who's not engaged in those kinds of activities for livelihood or who's trying to influence a particular decision maker. So it's trying to de-link the process of fundraising or contributions from governmental decision making.
For the perception of pay to play, as it were.
Yeah, and to that I would also add that, and I think attachment 1 is helpful to point this out, is that we have actual numbers about campaign contributions that lobbyists are involved in bundling. And we've had that data for about 2 years now due to a change in the lobbyist regulations that was adopted by this commission in 2014. So we actually have hard numbers. You can actually see the activity, bundling activity, that lobbyists have been engaging over the past couple of years. Right now, we don't have that data for non-lobbyist bundlers. So if you're just another kind of a non-lobbyist who's out there bundling contribution for a local official, at this point we don't actually have a picture of what that looks like. Now that's not to say we couldn't have some sort of bundling reporting or bundling disclosure that applies more broadly to people who contribute to city officials. I mean, that's something that we can certainly explore. It's a slightly different proposal than what we've been considering, but I'm sure it goes on, but we don't know exactly what it looks like at this point.
Could I ask the city attorney, if we were to tonight go ahead and do as Chair Rennie suggests, which makes a lot of sense, have the language parallel the state's approach, which is also part of the recommendation of the Friends of Ethics, would we be able to still pass the measure tonight to put it on the ballot, or would we need more interested persons type situation, input in regard to it? Because mainly if we don't pass it tonight, we have one more chance at the end of July. But there's only 4 of us here, and we need 4 votes. So I hate to tempt the gods in regard to blowing our chance of getting a really good ballot measure on the ballot. So one of the things that was indicated by the Friends of Ethics is that we could direct the staff and the city attorney, if we chose to, direct the staff and the city attorney to go ahead and make that change in the language to make it parallel to the state approach, subject to the review of the chair, and still pass it tonight to put it on the ballot. Can we do that?
I would certainly prefer to have additional time if we're drafting entirely new provisions of the ballot measure. As you mentioned, we do have the opportunity to have an additional regular commission meeting on the subject, because it is not going to be a simple cut and paste from state law. It's something that we would want to carefully draft. And of course, my office has a lot of procedures in place in terms of making sure that anything that is put on the ballot by anybody is as good as we can make it. But I also did want to give Leanne an opportunity to address this issue because I think there may be some practical or operational concerns about mirroring the state ban, again, which is focused on making sure the lobbyists are not allowed to make contributions to those officials that they're registered to contact or they have contact within a certain period and things of that sort.
I would just add, I think if the commission wanted to take that approach, it would be helpful to take a bit more time to craft perhaps companion language that says this is how lobbyists will now have to disclose who they are planning to or who they have who they're planning to lobby, so that the ban can be applied clearly. Because right now, you'll recall, the law does not require lobbyists to say who they're planning to lobby. They don't have to register to lobby certain departments. It's essentially once you lobby, the assumption is you're going to be lobbying anybody who's on the list of city officials. So if the commission were taking this approach, we would have to come up with some language that says here's how you do it mechanically, so that I think it has so it can be put in place in practice in an effective way. I think the other thing that we would need to do with that is also make some changes to the online filing system that the lobbyists are using currently to register. And so that clearly we're at a point where we appear to be moving forward with our electronic filing conversion project. If we needed to make some changes, this would be a smart time to do that. It's not currently built into the scope of that project. So we would need to take a look at that and then find out how we can actually have the resources to make that happen at the same time we're doing this other work.
Is it feasible, do you think it's feasible for city lobbyists to have to identify what departments or what agencies they're intending to lobby? Or if they don't, that it would be presumed that they are lobbying the whole administration?
I think that's language I'd want to take a look at. It would be fair to presume that they're lobbying the entire body of city officials who they can, so the city officers, who is the group of people they can currently lobby. I think in practice, I would speculate that most of the campaign contributions are going to the Board of Supervisors and other elected officials who can shape policy, not to the whole host of other city officers who may be implementing those policies. I could be wrong, but I think it's probably very much focused on the legislative body.
Any other questions?
Well, it seems to me that taking a thoughtful approach to drafting this ballot measure is really critical, because I would hate to see it pass and then be struck down next year, a year from now. And that I don't know if anyone has vacation plans for next month, so the 4 of us could be here, because I think that if the city attorney and Director Pelham and her staff could take the time to explore what alternative language would look like in a way that could accomplish the goals that are set out, but in a way that would minimize the risk of legal challenge, I think would be to our benefit.
I wonder if you could articulate a little further the pros and cons of paralleling the state legislation that exists. I mean, how important is it that we mirror what the state has, or does it not matter at all? Is it a disadvantage to us?
As I understand it, and the city attorney can clarify if I'm wrong, but that the danger of a ban on on contribution by lobbyists or setting a lower amount that they can contribute. If you do it across the board, and even though those lobbyists may not be having any contact with an official, that you run the risk that the court can say that you're impinging on their right of free speech. They have a right to support candidates. Even if we put a contribution ban on, there's nothing that stops the lobbyist from saying, I'm supporting the Mayor Lee or whoever the candidate is. All you're saying is, if you the state approach is saying, if as a lobbyist, one of your responsibilities is contacting the mayor, then you can't make campaign contributions to the mayor. You can to the Board of Supervisors if you don't have any contact with them. And all, so that it's narrowing, in one sense, the supposed impact, but it's not interfering with their right to support with campaign contributions to individuals whom they are not lobbying, as opposed to if we say you could, none except you can give $250, that the court could say that's an unreasonable restraint on them, and that we don't show, I mean, $250 isn't sufficient, that they should be allowed to give the full amount. That's all.
Yeah, and if I could simply add, in echoing some of Leanne's comments, you know, San Francisco's lobbyist ordinance does not require lobbyists to indicate who they're going to lobby before they do it. They simply make those contacts and report them after the fact. You know, in thinking through how this could work, and it'd be very helpful to get the Commission's views on this, you know, in terms of sort of an advanced registration requirement, which would be a new feature of our lobbyist ordinance, something else we would have to do to make this work. I mean, we'd have to think through issues, you know, obviously I'll have these discussions with the executive director about, you know, how far in advance does that advanced registration need to be? You know, how much notice do you need to provide to the Ethics Commission and to the public that you intend to lobby the mayor next week or the Board of Supervisors next month? We'd have to think about how the lobbyist ordinance works, because it doesn't work that way at all right now. Obviously, you know, we could certainly use more time if that's where the Commission's inclined to go.
I would also be concerned that if there would be the imposition of additional reporting requirements that the Commission's not able to support from a resource standpoint, that we need to be very thoughtful about that before we embark on you know, signing up for something that we won't be able to deliver in a reasonable time frame.
We'll call for public comment.
Thank you, Commissioners. Elena Schmidt with Friends of Ethics. I appreciate very much the discussion that you're having right now about the state, using the state as a model, since Friends of Ethics did put it forward, and that's what I'm going to speak to a little bit, and will not obviously be able to answer all the questions that you have about it, but let me just put out a couple things. Before I go that, I just have to acknowledge that it's a little bit of deja vu all over again. I mean, it was just about this time last year when we were urging you to go forward with an initiative to put on the 2015 ballot, which you did, which the citizens supported overwhelmingly. And again, we're going to urge you to keep moving on this very interesting and strong initiative that you're putting together now, that the Commission staff has worked on, that Represent Us has worked on, and Friends of Ethics. And I appreciate all the work that's gone into it and the amount of review and careful thought that has gone into it. I think that Represent Us has been an important ally for us and has helped considerably in clarifying language and having us think it through very carefully. you know that through the letters that we sent you, we have proposed that you look at the state and see what's going on. The part that we're saying you should look at for the state is the provision dealing with the lobbyist contributions, and that it's a provision that's already in place. It provides a good framework that you could use going forward, and it includes all the components that we had been talking about, and it does so easily. It's in place, and it already has a precedent. I would note from the question that the chair asked about the registration that the way FOE looks at it, that at both the state and the Los Angeles registration, if the lobbyist does not select a limited authorization, then it applies across the board. So it actually is simpler in that way. The comparison between the two, between what you have in front of you tonight and what the state is talking about, is that the current proposal, as the executive director said, limits some of the contribution. The state limits some of the control. I can't even talk when the bell goes off. The committees, and that the state covers all committees, which is really important. So it's both the candidate-controlled committees and the non-candidate controlled committees, so they can be the specific committees. So it's a much broader issue. Thank you for the consideration, and I hope that we keep the discussion going on the state, using the state as a model.
Thank you.
Good to be back, Commissioners. I'm thinking that we don't really have to reinvent the wheel. When you take a look at the state law, realizing that it comes out of the Political Reform Act, which was written by Bob Stern probably 40 years ago, we can take that as our basis and take the issues that have come up in the IP meetings and put those together. And I think when you take a look at the state law, you'll see how readily available that law is to this purpose, that we can put these two together without too much difficulty, and also it will dovetail into the databases. You've done an excellent data compilation here. I'm glad we changed the law previously. I also wanted to thank you for the findings, because I think in time we're going to see those findings are very important, because they'll frame our own mind as to what this is accomplishing. But I do want to say that I think once you roll up your sleeves and get to scrubbing the state law, you'll see how the current state law is something that we can readily use. And this is, I suspect, the decision that they came to in Los Angeles. Perhaps our executive director would have more insight on that, although it may predate her, because as you know, this part of our law dates back to the 1970s and early 1980s. So you have to be pretty old to have a perspective.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners and staff and Executive Director, Ms. Pelham. I'm from California Common Cause. My name is Helen Grieco, and we submitted a letter today for your consideration. Our board had time to make a formal decision on the 7 final recommendations because we didn't have enough time, but we did have time to state some of our concerns. So generally speaking, we strongly support restrictions on lobbyists' ability to influence elected officials. We also think that gifts and contributions from lobbyist employers are a significant source of the problem in money in politics, but that may be for another day. We also support the lobbyist gift ban in principle, but we need to look more closely at the exemptions to the gift ban. We do acknowledge that gifts from lobbyists for travel have become a boondoggle that erodes the public's confidence. There's a list of comments and questions, which I won't go over, but I will say that one of the comments that came up a number of times on our policy call today was questioning why you hadn't paralleled the state law. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. It is all well and good to give the citizens of San Francisco an opportunity to update the laws on lobbyist gifts, campaign contributions, and bundled contributions. However, let's not deceive the public into thinking that you're actually going to enforce these laws in any meaningful way. As we've seen recently with your decision relating to Supervisor Mark Farrell, you are unable to enforce these laws as relates to anyone in the city family. In that case, as in a number of other cases, you go into hiding or closed session so the public will not realize how totally ineffective you truly are. No one in San Francisco government will back up your findings unless they have a political agenda to do so, which we saw very clearly in the case of the mayor and former Sheriff Ross Mirakarimi. You can bully the powerless, but you are continually bullied by the powerful. An old Southern expression again sums it up well, bears repeating: you're about as useful as tits on a boar hog. And very frankly, I think this last-minute Durham and Strang about whether we should have done this or should have done that, when you've been going through this conversation for months, is nothing but an attempt to delay it and keep it off the ballot, and or getting it parallel to the state, then being able to say, oh, don't come to us about this, go to the FPPC in Sacramento, which is exactly what you did to us when we brought the case to the Ethics Commission relating to City Librarian Luis Herrera accepting $15,000 worth of gifts from a group he was supposed to oversee. And we brought it to this Ethics Commission, and Mr. St. Croix just simply said, we're not going to deal with it. If you aren't going to enforce the law, rearranging the law, rewriting the law over and over and over again is nothing but rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Thank you.
This is a corrupt, corrupt city.
I'm Bob Planthold, here as a member of Friends of Ethics. Again, we support getting the essential ballot measure authorized for November of this year, because otherwise there won't be a chance until June of 2018. I thought I heard the executive director say that the provisions of this would not apply to expenditure lobbyists. If that's correct, since you're now considering adding language for another matter to mirror or parallel the state, I want to ask you to consider asking staff to draft two versions, the one currently and one including expenditure lobbyists. We passed Measure C that dealt with that. We heard nobody's registered as that. If you don't include them in this, there's no pressure. Right now, expenditure lobbyists aren't going to feel they really have to pay attention to all of these factors and requirements. I think to be consistent with Measure C from last year, you ought to consider having it apply to expenditure lobbyists. I heard you talk about hoping you get 4 people for your regular meeting in July. And again, I would suggest that just summarily, you could also put your calendars together with staff and city attorney in the occasion that there may be a special meeting needed. If somebody has a wedding or a funeral that would preclude them from attending the regular meeting, you may need to have a special. Do it after tonight's meeting so you can get that calendar consistency. And I will say finally, I really want to encourage you to be very narrow in your consideration of exemptions, of types of agencies and types of activities of agencies. You want to be sure that, as we often have used as the boogeyman, the Koch brothers do not find the types of exemptions that you might authorize and then develop their own San Francisco AstroTurf surrogate. And again, we're talking about having restrictions apply to agencies that provide direct services that are not necessarily clearinghouses. I think that's an important distinction that you need to be clear on as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Hill. I'm speaking on behalf of Represent Us. I wanted to speak specifically to the issue of the lobbyist contribution limit versus ban. There have been two reasons why courts will uphold an outright ban on lobbyist contributions, and those are, one, if there has been a public scandal involving lobbyists making political donations, and the other is when the ban has been narrowly tailored, as we discussed here. Currently, we do not in San Francisco have the ability to determine which elected officials a lobbyist plans to lobby. So in the absence of that sort of setup, and in the absence of public scandal involving lobbyist contributions, we at Represent Us recommend taking the other approach of just imposing a low limit on lobbyist contributions. These low limits have been upheld in places like New York City, where they also gave lobbyists about a contribution limit that is about 1/10 the limit of what other, regular members of society face. It was actually a little lower than a 1/10 limit, and ours would be a 1/10 limit. So that is Represent Us' stance there. To the issue of, contact versus expenditure lobbyists, as you know, Prop C created a new category of lobbyists, expenditure lobbyists. We would recommend that for the time being, the Commission add language making clear that the use of the term lobbyist in this ballot initiative mean contact lobbyist only until the Commission by vote determines that it should also mean expenditure lobbyist, and that would just give you the time to evaluate whether this should also apply to expenditure lobbyists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Morgan Aiken-Young with Represent Us San Francisco. I won't take up too much of your time. I just want to thank you all for the careful consideration and all the work that has gone into this. It means a lot to us as local citizens and activists. So I would just like to reiterate that we're calling for a low limit rather than a ban, and that $250 is just too much. It's not sufficiently low to instill public confidence, and we would suggest a $50 limit, 1/10 of the current limit. We've shown the data that's included that everyone has to show that this is needed, and that lobbyists regularly give the maximum $500 contributions, and that special low limits such as these exist elsewhere, as Charlotte said, in New York City, and that it has been upheld. So we'd like to make it as easy to uphold and not get thrown out based on those issues. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I am David. I'm also from Represent Us. And I'd just like to say that Prop C last year passed with 75% of the city supporting it. You've seen what the people of the city feel about city government. You've seen what we feel about how integrity should be handled in city government. The people are thirsty for common sense reforms like these. We have seen people be incredulous. They didn't believe us that we told them that there was no limit on travel gifts, right? That this was a major loophole. People couldn't believe that San Francisco could be this way. We're here to bring San Francisco back to a level that we can be proud of, at least. Most people would assume that we would be at the forefront of something like this, that we would be striving and leading the nation and the state in terms of how we dealt with ethics in government. And to see some of the exemptions that currently exist is heartbreaking. So we'd just like to ask you to make sure that you don't dilly-dally on this, that this is important to a lot of the citizens of San Francisco. And they would greatly appreciate if we kept our fight against and fight for city integrity alive, and that this proposition makes it onto the ballot this year. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Tyler, and I'm with Represent Us. I just wanted to add a point that these restrictions are not only good for instilling public confidence, but they are also help lobbyists avoid undue pressure. Most lobbyists want to go and do their job and provide information or expertise on behalf of their clients without feeling pressure that they have to give a maximum donation or a gift in order to attain an ear of a politician or an elected official. These restrictions will help relieve them of that bind and allow them to do their job more effectively without having to feel like they have to contribute something in order to maintain maximum effectiveness in their career. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. Debbie Lerman from the San Francisco Human Services Network, an association of health and human service nonprofits in San Francisco. First of all, I would like to say that we view this draft measure as, for the most part, a good government reform package and something that we would love to be able to support. We did participate, along with the Council of Community Housing Organizations, in the interested persons meeting and expressed a couple of concerns, and we're disappointed that they don't seem to have been addressed or even an explanation about why they weren't addressed. And I would hope to see some response to that before this becomes finalized. We believe that the matters that we would like to see addressed are actually very narrow, common sense types of exemptions, and would be happy to work with the staff, the commissioners, the Friends of Ethics, and Represent Us to craft language that would be appropriate and hopefully something we can reach consensus around so that we can all support this going forward. One of them is a simple clarification. They both relate to the gift limits, and it's a simple clarification that when we have open houses and community events that are free to everybody, including the public, that it is not a gift if Mayor Ed Lee comes in and has a glass of wine or a donut. And so for those types of events where it's something offered in the regular course of business to the public at large without regard to official status, that should not be considered a gift. The second is a very narrow exemption for attendance at conferences. We often have public officials who speak at our conferences or attend a conference. That is a good thing for the city. It is good for us to be talking to each other. It is good for public officials to speak with their constituents and to participate in events. And we have very low conference registration. We would like to see a narrow exemption where we can invite public officials to conferences and symposia without having to charge the $35 registration fee. Or if they're speaking and none of the speakers are paying the fee, then the public official should not have to pay the fee. If all the participants are getting a sandwich with their registration, the public official should get a sandwich with the registration. A narrow dollar limit would be fine. We don't care about special hospitality rooms. It's fine to rule those out. But we would like to see something that, as we had a previous memo on May 20th, I brought copies because it's not in today's packet, but some kind of language that we could work on together that would still allow officials of the City and County of San Francisco to participate in conferences without the city having to write a fee or a registration check for every little event, and would appreciate your consideration of that. Thank you, and I'll pass on those copies.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Greg Bryan. I'm an attorney and I'm also with Represent Us. And I was just at a couple of comments to make. The first thing is I think it's very important that this be included on the November ballot initiative. And so that I think is like what the primary thing we're focused on. But the other thing too is just so you're aware with regards to lobbyists, I personally feel that expenditure lobbyists should be included. The only concern I really have is that if the expenditure lobbyists are not included, then it's going to be a loophole that may be exploited later on by other parties. The other thing is if it's going to delay the whole process and force it to go into some type of large review or something like that where it may push the initiative back, then that's something that we may just want to start with the contact lobbyist and then work on the expenditure lobbyists or try and do something about that later. Thank you for your time, and I strongly support this legislation.
Thank you. Going back to the question about the state, where you say that the lobbyists in the state identify what agency or what official they're going to be lobbying. But one of the speakers said that there is a provision in the state that says, but if you haven't identified a specific one, there's a presumption that you are lobbying all the agencies. Is that correct?
I don't know. I wasn't aware of that presumption. I can look into it in advance of the next meeting.
I mean, is there a problem if we were to try and take sort of the state approach But in San Francisco, where they don't identify, the lobbyist doesn't identify when he or she registers or it registers, that we could provide in this that it's limited, its impact, the prohibition is limited to any agency or official who you've registered to lobbyist, and that if you have not identified, there will be a presumption that you are lobbying, you are intending to lobby all elected officials, and that would prohibit them. And they could then turn around and say, well, no, we aren't really doing that, and they register and say, we're only going to lobby the Board of Supervisors.
Do you want to? Okay. Yeah. So I think that's definitely an approach we could work on. But let me ask a follow-up question in terms of this movement. It seems like to mirror the state law approach as much as possible. So, one thing I just want to gain some clarification on is the draft proposed for the commission tonight is not an absolute ban on lobbyist contributions.
Right.
What we're proposing is a lower dollar limit.
Right.
So I'm not sure if that's still the commission, the direction it's heading, because state law prohibits contributions altogether from lobbyists with respect to the officials who are registered to lobby.
Correct.
As opposed to a lower dollar limit. So I'm not sure if we're still working on sort of the lower dollar limit paradigm, and if so, whether the commission is comfortable making a decision of what the appropriate dollar limit is. In the draft, we have a few proposed dollar figures. I don't know if the commission is prepared to give us direction about which of those dollar figures it feels appropriate.
I think that's a fair question, and is there, it puts more work on the staff, but is there any reason why we sort of can't have an alternate approach for the commission to finally agree on? And I guess I should find, is anybody going on vacation? On our next date is July.
Right, that's probably the most important threshold question.
Yeah.
Is it
July? What's our date?
It's 25th, I think.
Yeah, July 25th.
Okay, 25th.
I'm
All right, I
here.
guess all four of us at this present moment intend to be here, so that, is there any reason why that we could not have, say, sort of under the prohibition or the limitation on campaign contributions, one approach being the approach that prohibits them from contributing to any official or agency who they lobby, with a presumption that if they haven't identified who it is, that they are intending to lobby all any elected official, and maybe give them a time period to re-register or refile, limiting whom they intend to lobby. And the approach that's suggested here had a dollar limit, and we can talk about that dollar limit. If that you think is doable.
I'm okay with you again.
All right, Commissioner Keene.
Could I add one thing also, Mr. Chair? I echo exactly what you said in terms of having that before us the next time, in terms of paralleling the state procedure as has been discussed and recommended by Friends of Ethics, and also, as the chair indicated earlier, to have the parallel procedure. And also we can do the options to have a ban or to have one of the three amounts that you suggested in the materials you have before us tonight, the $250, the $100 or whatever, and that we choose one of those if we choose not to go for a ban. But could I also emphasize one of the things that has been put by some of the speakers, and I think it's very important, particularly in light of Prop C and everything we've done on expenditure lobbyists, that the measure be written uniformly to define lobbyists as both contact lobbyists and expenditure lobbyists. The whole thrust of what we did last year and the whole thrust of what we've been doing is to not have any distinction between the two, that a contact lobbyist and an expenditure lobbyist is a lobbyist, and is going to be subject to the same kind of scrutiny. Could, Mr. Chair, if I could ask that be incorporated into your directions to the staff for the writing of it, and have that before us next time?
Right. I would join in that suggestion because when we're talking about political contributions, I don't know why a individual or an entity that's been identified as an expenditure lobbyist should not be subject to the same restrictions as a contact lobbyist.
So thank you for bringing up that issue. Just to clarify, I think what this draft was intended to propose the Commission tonight. So when it refers to lobbyist or lobbyists, it includes both categories. And that's how the term is currently defined in the lobbyist ordinance. I will admit there's one place that I forgot to take out the word contact on page 4, line 15. But that was just an inadvertent inclusion of the word contact. But otherwise, what staff had asked me to draft for the Commission tonight was something that was going to apply to both types of lobbyists that we recognize in local law.
Isn't there also some reference in another part of it? I think it's not in the part where we're dealing with, but I think it was pointed out to us by Friends of Ethics. The number sort of comes to mind, 2015 or 2.15, where they specifically refer to contact lobbyists, and there's a recommendation from Mr. Bush in one of his correspondence with us that be specifically amended to be contact and expenditure lobbyists.
Yeah, that was the one inadvertent inclusion of the word
All
contact.
right.
And
Great.
also the Represent Us people, I guess, should get some credit because they caught the same thing.
Right.
And so that was, again, just an inadvertent thing. Everywhere else in the proposal, it just referred to lobbyist or lobbyists as opposed to the either kind.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much.
But of course, if that's, I don't know if the other commissioners want to weigh in the issue as well, but.
Yeah, thank you very much. The only other thing I'd add, Mr. Chair, is I want to really compliment the staff, Ms. Pelham and the city attorney, for this effort that they've put into this. This is excellent. They've done a fine job, a really wonderful job on it. And particularly, I want to commend Ms. Pelham for her explanations of it and her explanations on KQED the other day to the public about what this is. You did a really good job in terms of telling them what we're doing and what this is all about. So I think going forward with this, we take it up the next time and put it on the ballot. I think it would be a great job all around.
Chair Rennie, could I also ask that that we request from Director Pelham just a brief summary as to, with respect to the outright ban and the limits, if there are any resource constraints that would affect the implementation of either course, so that we can have a sense of whether it's in the budget, for example, for the coming year to be able to implement one course or the other.
I think it'll be helpful to take a look at our system this week to help flesh out that for the next month's meeting. I mean, there will be, the reality of all of these proposals is that there are implications for operations. Those should never be reasons. The fact that a system currently doesn't do something should never be a reason to not adopt good policy. So that is not what I'm saying. But it is important to, I think, take a look and make sure that we have thoughtfully brought forward other changes that might need to happen to make these kinds of provisions take place. So we can address that in the next go on this. My recommendation or thought would be it would be helpful for us so we have clarity, both the city attorney and myself. Perhaps if we could go through the recommendations that are here and to get the commission's sense of the direction you'd like us to make sure that you see in the language that comes forward. There have been a number of issues talked about in a variety of areas, but if we could get, it could be a vote, it doesn't have to be a vote, but just to get some consensus about what you'd like to see coming back, that would be help jumpstart the process for next month. So, for example, on page 2, under the recommendations, recommendation 1, there's some general language with regard to the finding. I don't know if there's been any reaction or different approach that you'd like to see there? Anything that strikes you?
Any of the commissioners have any comment? I felt that additional language, I thought, filled probably one of the grounds to support it that doesn't presently appear. So I would recommend that we adopt that recommendation one.
There was a comment by Represent Us by Alex Kaplan, who couldn't be here this evening, but he did provide a comment on page 2, line 7. After the first word officers, a suggestion that it should also read and candidates for city office, to be consistent that that's also a group that's being affected by the proposed changes. So on line 7, it would the proposal is to read officers and candidates for city office.
That's on line 7.
Yes, on page 2 of the draft. Line 7 would begin by saying officers and candidates for city office. If there aren't any, if there's no concerns about that, we would include that.
Okay. Recommendation number 2 relates to.
Yes, that relates to the ability to amend. Again, there was some comment by Friends of Ethics about late this afternoon, I believe, about whether there might be some alternative language. But the goal that this language is trying to provide for is that, like language that currently exists, it would outline how the provisions could be amended in the future. And it identifies the conditions that have to be met under A through D. This would just add the language of the topic of the current ballot measure that's being contemplated.
As I understood the comment from Friends of Ethics, what they wanted added is a provision that it couldn't be repealed or that has happened in the past. And I think when the language talks about it has to be consistent with the purpose of the ordinance, it's hard to believe that one could say that a repealing of the ordinance is consistent. But do any commissioners have any thoughts as to whether or not there should be some additional provision making it clear that the commission and the Board of Supervisors can't, in effect, repeal it?
I think that's the fact that it has to be in furtherance of the ordinance, and also the reiteration of just the procedure that it would again have to take 4 votes of this body and 2/3 votes of the Board of Supervisors. That's enough to give me confidence in regard to the fact that nobody can easily tinker with it.
I hold it, and you'll have a chance before we go any further. But let's finish through this memo. Thank you. So that at least the sense that I get that the commission doesn't believe that it's necessary to make the change that was suggested.
Okay.
The next is gifts.
Yes, on page 4 with recommendation 3, the thrust of this proposal would be to prohibit lobbyists from making any gifts, including gifts of travel. It would include a litany of individuals who also are included in that. And it would, in essence, remove the $25 existing de minimis that lobbyists are able to make in gifts per year to officials. The definition that's used here would still be the definition in state law with all the associated other exemptions that exist under state law. But it would remove the $25 de minimis for lobbyists and ban gifts of travel.
Are we bound by the exemptions that are set forth in state law?
Only to the extent that we use the terms as defined in state law. We could alternatively exempt or carve out some of the exemptions if there are ones that as you heard earlier this evening, make sense to you, that you think would be useful. But it is it's a pretty long, complicated list of what the state treats as gifts and it doesn't treat as gifts. But if we attach ourselves to that definition, then we would be attached to those exemptions. We could add our own, others.
Or we could delete.
Or we could, yeah.
So I think it would be helpful to see what that list of exemptions is, if we adopt the state, what the list of exemptions are, to see whether there are any that have been identified by some of the members of the public as being loopholes to what we're trying to accomplish.
And for purposes of drafting for the next round, do you have a sense for your action next month? Do you have a sense at this point, as commissioners, about the issue raised about events attended in the normal course of business by officials, where everybody who goes to the event gets the bottle of water, those sorts of free, open events to the public? Or did you want us to take a look further at what the exemptions are so that you can look at them overall and make decisions next month?
Well, the concerns that were raised by some, and which I am sympathetic to, is that some of these, whether it's Apple that has a convention or somebody else, and they have private parties that they set up and meet with the officials. And that's one of the things that I think the public really reacts to. But yet I think under the exemption, that would be perfectly all right. But
yeah, just to expand a little bit on that issue, again, to make sure we're coming back with what you expect. So, under state law, which is mostly what this is reverting to, we're incorporating the state law definition of a gift. Simply going to a party hosted by some corporate entity, that would be a gift to the official.
That would?
That would be a gift to the official. Yep. And since we're lowering it from $25, at least of it right now, down to $0, it would be anything at the party. So you walk in, you have a bottle of water, that's a prohibited gift. You walk in, you have a glass of wine, that's a prohibited gift. You come in, you have a bag of chips, that's a prohibited gift. We're completely prohibiting it if the source of the gift is a lobbyist, of course. So if we're talking about entities like Apple, Google, whatever tech company that people choose to focus on, some of those entities may not be a lobbyist. I mean, that's also one thing to bear in mind. We're only talking about gifts from lobbyists in this proposal. One exception that seems to be kind of coming up, at least in the course of the discussion, is about admission to conferences. So under state law, admission to a conference, so long as that official is attending for the purpose of gathering information and the subject matter of the conference has some relevance to that official's duties, that's a gift exception. So that allows you to go into a seminar, go into some, breakout sessions or whatnot, and listen to the information provided. But it doesn't let you take all the freebies that may be associated with that conference. It's not uncommon for a lot of corporate conferences to have associated dinners or cocktail parties or whatever, grab bags of goodies, those sorts of things. Those things would still be gifts that are prohibited under this proposal, subject to a $0 limit.
But these are gifts that are by lobbyists.
Again, we're only talking about gifts from lobbyists.
Right.
So, frankly, I'm not sure how often that comes up. But yes, that would be kind of how it works. In general, state law has a couple dozen gift exceptions, but those seem the couple that we just talked about seem to be the ones that are coming up most in these discussions.
Any discussion about the language that's recommended for gift prohibition? Commissioner King?
Go ahead.
Why wouldn't we allow the bottle of water in a de minimis amount of $25 or less, 10, 15, 20? I mean,
I don't know why we wouldn't either, but the likelihood that it's a lobbyist who's giving them the bottle of water, it seems to me it'd have to be a convention or a conference organized by the lobbyist. If it's a non-lobbyist who is organizing the convention or the conference, I wouldn't think the gift ban even comes into play, does it?
Right. I mean, again, as you point out, we're talking about gifts given by lobbyists. Right. And so I don't know how often that happens, but I don't think it's that common, perhaps. And certainly, if you do want to build in a de minimis exception or not, it would be helpful to get that direction tonight. And just as again, as a point of reference, state law has, a little less than a couple dozen gift exceptions. So I don't know if you want to come back with all of them and run down through the exceptions, but there's a fair number of gift exceptions. So I'm not sure exactly how you want to approach that issue in terms of coming back with a draft.
Well,
I think it would be helpful if Andrew, the city attorney, and the executive director and your staff were to review the long litany of gifts. If you could make that available for us, but have a recommendation as to what would be appropriate to be included or not in the definition of gift.
Okay.
I think that might be helpful.
That'd be great. Yeah, any direction, again, you can sort of provide that subject would be helpful. And I think a lot of the exceptions are frankly probably not objectionable. For example, one of the most common gift exceptions in state law is things provided by your family. Anything provided by an official's family is not a gift to that official. I don't imagine that would be controversial here. So perhaps we can do it pretty quickly, or at least in sort of a format where we can really highlight a couple for the commission to point out. But again, just want to make sure that we're not surprising you in terms of what we come back with next month.
No, I think the suggestion that Commissioner Chu made is good, and that is give us the list, and we can decide whether or not we want to somehow or other exclude the exemption from our definition of gift, because that's really what we're doing, is saying we're following the state's definition of gift, except that we do not exempt from the definition of gift the following.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Contributions, I think the limit on contribution, I think we've covered that. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that, again, I understand what the commission wants. So on the contribution limit, you want two alternatives. The first would be one that requires a lobbyist to pre-register the agency or official they're going to lobby, which they're not currently required to do. And under this registration model, there would be complete prohibition on contributions. So that would be option one. Option two is what we have, I guess, tonight, which is there is no pre-registration requirement, but there's a lower dollar limit, as opposed to an outright ban on lobbyist contributions. Is that correct?
Right, and we have not discussed and decided what that lower contribution limit should be. The 250 is what, 50% of what they could ordinarily give. Doesn't $100 would be a fifth. Any of the commissioners have a view as to where they would like to see that limit be set?
I'd like it to be set at $100, just in order to make some statement in regard to a limitation on it. To set it too low, like 50 or 10 or some of the other, does make it vulnerable to the whole idea that you're limiting symbolic speech by virtue of some sort of contribution. So I think $100 would be a good amount to use.
I don't have any objection.
I would agree.
I think that's the sense of the commission, that use $100, and then we can visit again when we do the final passage. And then bundled contributions.
So based on the commission's sense so far, under recommendation 5, the approach would, as it's outlined here, would limit how much it would be a limitation, not an outright ban. Again, I suppose that's another question to address. But in this limitation approach, it would propose that a lobbyist would be restricted to limit to transmitting or delivering no more than $100 in total, which would include the lobbyist's own contribution and any contributions transmitted or delivered by that were others' contributions.
And if the other version were to be adopted, that is the complete prohibition, there would be a complete prohibition on the lobbyist participating in any kind of bundling activity, right?
I think that's an independent question. I mean, I guess that's what would be helpful to clarify, yeah. If the commission wants to say that there's no contributions being made under Alternative 1, then the question, I guess, would still remain is a bundling ban on the transmission of lobbyist contributions from is it a ban, and does it apply only to contributions transmitted by others, since the lobbyist wouldn't be able to make their own contribution? So there are, I'm not sure if I'm being very clear.
I guess I would be more comfortable with it, with a complete prohibition that lobbyists cannot participate in the collection and bundling of contributions to the candidates, and to a candidate-controlled committee, or to a committee that may have as its purpose some furthering of the candidate's agenda.
And is that, would that be under the, would that be following the approach taken under Alternative 1?
Right.
If they pre-registered and identified which officials they were going to lobby, then insofar as that is the approach taken, they would not be able to bundle contributions to those individuals as well.
Right. Right.
Okay.
In other words, that if they registered, say, to that they intended only to lobby the mayor's office, they would be free to bundle, as any other individual is, bundle board of supervisor candidates.
So no limitations on bundling if they're not lobbying that individual, not lobbying a particular official. Is that? Many moving parts to this. It's difficult. Yeah.
I'd be more, I don't know, that gives me some pause in terms of, as long as they then register, they can still go ahead and bundle up these massive amounts. I'd like a limitation on that, and given to be consistent with what we've been doing to trying to prevent abuse, trying to prevent corruption, I think it would be a good idea if we kept this, assuming the bundler does indeed do all the things that's required of the bundler to bundle, that the bundler cannot give any more than any of these. I'd keep that situation to $100 as well.
So if a lobbyist is registered to lobby certain officials, they cannot. They would have a contribution ban outright, and they would also have a bundling ban outright as to those officials. And then, are you suggesting that to the extent they do not pre-register to lobby other officials, a bundling restriction would still apply in that scenario, up to the $100 limit established under a contribution ban?
Yes.
Okay. No, it would only be, it would still be this approach. Yes.
Okay.
And if, one moment, please. So as to bundling, what I want to be clear we're chatting about here to make sure we understand, there'll be an alternative one that comes forward that is founded on the presumption that there will be a ban on contributions to lobbyists to the extent that they register to lobby certain officials. The contribution ban would apply to those officials, the lobbyist's ability to give to those officials. In addition, under that scenario, there would also be a ban on lobbyists from transmitting, as we've described it here, bundling as we've defined it here, from bundling any contributions to those officials that they also are registered to lobby. So under that scenario, if a lobbyist is not registering to lobby a certain city officials, they would be subject to a contribution limit of, fill in the blank for just a moment, hold that thought, but they would be subject to a contribution limit still as proposed, and they would still be subject to a bundling limit to those officials that they are not directly lobbying, as recommended in recommendation 5. Is that, am I having that so far, or am I making it more confused?
No, I think you outlined it well. It just
I follow that, and that's what I would suggest, yes.
Right. So we can certainly modify this alternative 1 as referring to it on that front. I guess I would just observe that I'm not sure if we're somewhat defeating the purpose. I thought the way sort of Chair Rennie had teed this up is that we want to focus on, as one alternative for further consideration, a pre-registration model, and under that model, essentially having a more targeted approach. But it seems like under this more targeted approach, alternative 1, we seem to be sort of broadening it again. Obviously, that's within the Commission's discretion to do, but I wonder if we're working a little bit counter purposes.
Well, that clearly was the inquiry about whether or not we could sort of have a hybrid. In other words, that we can put a complete ban on lobbyists contributing to those offices to which it's directly lobbying, but have a general saying, if you're a lobbyist, even if you aren't lobbying anybody else in the government, we still can only contribute $100. The problem I have with it is that opens up the whole question of whether or not it's whether we've targeted sufficiently to not interfere with their free speech rights. That a lobbyist, merely because he or she is a lobbyist, doesn't mean that they aren't free to support political candidates. And the only purpose of a contribution, a prohibition on contribution is they shouldn't be able to use money to try and influence the very people that they're lobbying. But that is an approach, a hybrid approach, which I would have some concern about, that we might find the second half of that being struck down as being clearly we're targeting them as a group and putting restrictions on them merely with the fact that they lobby some city official.
But I thought what we were talking about was those restrictions would only allow us to bundling. Is that
right? So again, that's what we're trying to get clarification on from here, again, to make sure we understand.
So if you're a lobbyist and you're registered, that I lobby the mayor and I lobby the board of supervisors, and you've registered, and you can do that. Then, and you go ahead and you want to give a contribution of your own to someone else who is a city official in regard to something relating to that person. You could give the contribution limits. However, if you bundle them, you'd be limited to $100. That's what I thought we were looking at bundling as an approach that we were trying to draw some limitations on. Maybe I've broken my own mind out of the pack here, and I'm off on some.
I don't know. I don't know. if you're going to put a $100 limit on bundling, I mean,
you're a
why would you
lobbyist.
bother to bundle?
If you're a lobbyist.
If you're a lobbyist, well, I mean, what, you're going to bundle, $10 checks? It's sort of silly. I mean, just
Could be.
ban bundling then.
I mean, I would be inclined to say that to the extent that a lobbyist identifies who he or she intends to lobby, let's say the mayor, that if that same lobbyist wants to participate bundling for the city treasurer, I don't think that we can have the same clear justification for why he or she shouldn't be able to do that when anybody else can do that for the city treasurer. But
And in that scenario, that would leave the lobbyist bundling, for example, to the treasurer to not be limited. Right, or a contribution to be limited other than the existing limit under city law, which is the $500.
Right.
So this alternative one sounds like it's actually the alternative, the proposal.
Well, I'll defer to my colleagues' concerns on that then.
with that, do you feel that we've given you the guidance that you need to bring to us in July a document which will be in the alternative to prepare for the November ballot?
If I can just walk it through one more time, I think, measure twice and cut once, as they say. So there will be an alternative that's brought forward that would establish a way of lobbyists identifying the offices that they will lobby. Under that approach, then, lobbyists would be prevented from contributing to those officers, those candidates, those officers. They would also be prohibited from bundling as to those offices. So if the lobbyist under the system does not register that they are going to be lobbying a particular office or individual, they are then only subject to the existing $500 contribution limit, and there would be no limitation on bundling because they are not in the practice of lobbying those officials. So I think that's the last that we heard. Does that reflect accurately what you were conveying?
Except that I think that there should be, if they fail to specify, that there is a presumption that they intend to lobby across all city agencies and officials.
Okay, we can include that. That's helpful.
But as you just articulated that, Director Pelham, and I would ask my colleagues here, haven't we just left the door open for them to bundle to officials and candidates through whom they have not registered to lobby? So you have 25 officials. I'm going to lobby 2, but I can still bundle to 23.
Correct.
Status quo.
Right. So current law.
So what are we accomplishing by doing that?
Well, what you're accomplishing is, I suppose the real world is that they aren't going to be identifying only one official that they're intending to lobby, and that they are prohibited from bundling either for all the city agencies or the ones that they say these are the only ones to whom I'm going to lobby.
But under the current draft that we have now, I don't understand the alternative, but the draft as it is before us today has a prohibition on bundling anybody to any official or candidate. Is that correct?
It's limited. It would
It's
be limited to the dollar
right, I'm
amount.
sorry,
It's
it's
not
limited, but
prohibited.
it's limited to $100. Wouldn't that be a broader reach to say that you can bundle, but you can only bundle $100, which is a very small amount?
Well, but you also can say it's a broader reach to say, rather than a prohibition on contribution, to say you can only contribute $100.
Right, you can reach more people with a smaller amount.
That's right. There's no doubt that the broad limiting contribution reaches more people, but my concern is it's vulnerable to the argument that it's not carefully tailored to the problem that you're trying to deal with, and that is the ability of the lobbyist to make contributions to a candidate.
But in terms of bundling, how much protection is there with regard to, and I guess this would be a question for the city attorney, how much constitutional protection is there for a lobbyist to engage in free speech on behalf of third parties?
I guess that's a tricky question to answer, but I think that, again, weighing the legal risks and benefits is ultimately up to the commission. But certainly, if you do have a more targeted ban or limitation, there is, the commission would be protecting itself from legal challenges. So again, there's sort of you have to weigh those things against one another. So ultimately, I'm not sure if, whether you want to prohibit it altogether or not. I mean, I think what Chair Rennie is really highlighting is that if we're really doing a focused proposal, then it does make sense under some existing case law to focus on, officials that the lobbyist is actually lobbying. If what we're concerned about is pay-to-play or appearance of pay-to-play. And that would make sense whether you, the lobbyist, is delivering a check or you, the lobbyist, on behalf of other people are delivering checks. It's the same, I guess, pay-to-play concern. Right, and also we are including expenditure lobbyists as well, at least at the current time.
Yeah.
Okay. I call for public comment. Wait a minute.
You want
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, so I think we're pretty clear on what we're calling Alternative 1. Alternative 2 would basically be what we have here tonight with a $100 limit. So we'll bring that back. And with respect to both Alternative 1 and Alternative 2, we'll also bring back, based on staff's input and recommendation, maybe further modifications to what would be a gift for these purposes. Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Before, just to clarify as well on the recommendation 6, I think the commission's made its clear distinction, alternative 6.2, which would develop these recommendations to apply to both contact and expenditure lobbyists. So that seems to be clearly the consensus of the commission. And then lastly, on the recommendations, recommendation 7 regarding commission regulations. Again, there was some comment by Friends of Ethics earlier this afternoon, I believe, about modifying some of this language, but the regulations language as it appears is to try and be clear that the Ethics Commission can issue regulations to implement the section, but they can't establish exceptions from the limits and prohibitions set forth in the measures. So if there's any additional comment or changes to that, it would be helpful to know.
All right. I'll call for public comment on item number 5.
Thank you, Commissioners. Debbie Lerman again from the Human Services Network. I just want to touch a little more on the gifts questions in response to some of your discussion. And first of all, because this measure would include expenditure lobbyists, which could include nonprofits, and because any exemptions need to be included in the measure itself under the last piece that you just discussed. It is very important to get it right the first time, and we look forward to looking at those exemptions at the next meeting. But I think what I'm suggesting around these types of exemptions, first of all, this party example, and it doesn't matter to me whether it's Apple or developers or a human service nonprofit. As Commissioner Keen has pointed out, we can't look at content-based. It may not be the most popular cause, or it might be our favorite cause, but we have to treat everybody the same. But I do think it's absurd to say that if an event is open to the general public and anybody can wander in and pick up a bottle of water, that we shouldn't have to say, well, you're a public official, so you can't have that bottle of water because the host happens to be a lobbyist. And nonprofits may now become lobbyists under Prop C. So it is something we need to be concerned about. You may be holding a party because you just cut the ribbon on a new facility, or you have a new executive director. And I think with both the conference question and the party question, or the community event question, the key really is there some potential here for undue influence? And I think the key words in my mind would be special treatment. If everybody in the public can pick up an hors d'oeuvre from the table, and the public official can pick up an hors d'oeuvre from the table but doesn't get anything extra, then what's the problem? If all of the speakers that you've invited to your conference are getting lunch and free registration, and the public official is getting lunch and free registration, I don't see the problem. And if there's a reasonable cap, I would understand that. I agree with the concern about private meet and greets and hospitality suites and things like that. That is a valid concern. I agree if it's a $500 conference with fancy, buffet, gourmet lunches and things like that. But for the type of, little community-based nonprofit conferences that we have, where there's a couple hundred people and there's a pile of sandwiches on the table, and the fee for the entire day is $50 or less than $100, and it's just very, community-based kind of event, I honestly don't see the undue influence, and I see many benefits from allowing public officials to participate, as long as they're not getting any special treatment that other participants are not getting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'd just like to talk about the bundling limits. So the idea behind registering every lobbyist to a set of public officials they would like to lobby is a new system that you'd be implementing for this. There need to be new enforcement mechanisms. This would be something totally new, some new paperwork and bureaucracy that would be necessary. And with that comes a risk. If, two lobbyists from the same firm lobby different parties, but then cross over and bundle to each other's, target officials, that would be legal currently. If you outlawed that, then two lobbying firms could have contracts with each other to have their lobbyists cross-bundling. The thing that I'm afraid of is that by introducing this kind of level of bureaucracy, there might be even more holes. You might just be going down a rabbit hole where we'd have to keep patching it up over and over again. So I just want to make sure that there's no issue in the future. That's something that does get passed now. We won't have to come back to it in a couple of years and say, now they're going around it, we'll need to make another more narrow ban. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Jonathan Minster. I'm an attorney at the Senate law firm. I have a fear that in some situations here, you guys have taken an approach kind of for regulation's sake, as opposed to really looking at a problem, identifying an issue, and then trying to create a solution. And I'll give you one example, because I'm not going to, whether we regulate contributions from lobbyists, there are public policy reasons for doing so. I'm not going to bore you with the details. But one example I have is including expenditure lobbyists in this regime of limiting gifts and contributions. And the reason I bring this up is because no one here has identified a public policy reason for doing so. It's one thing to say, look, we're not going to allow lobbyists who contact the Board of Supervisors every day to give gifts or political contributions, because that's how you gain favor. That's how you curry favor. These are people you're talking to every day. These are people you're trying to seek to influence. But with expenditure lobbyists, these are people who are indirectly seeking others to contact the Board of Supervisors. These are people putting out the ads saying, hey, call your Board of Supervisors and tell them don't support this or don't do that. Is there really a public policy reason for not allowing these organizations, peoples, individuals, whoever they may be, to not give a gift of, $100 to a city official, give a plaque to someone who does something good? I think that's a real concern here. Same thing with the contribution limits. In what way are you currying favor? What problem are you trying to solve by having an expenditure lobbyist, a nonprofit organization that does housing, that says contact your Board of Supervisors to increase affordable housing by voting for this measure? Are we really creating, saving the public in any way by not allowing them to make, contributions or gifts? And it's worth noting the contribution limits of $500, the gift limits on the state limits, which apply to all public officials, of $460, are not exactly huge in their respects either. Second point I want to bring up is I really feel that you guys should follow the state definition of gift. Honestly, just for simplicity's sake. The state definition of gifts does have a handful of carve-outs. These are very, very, very simple carve-outs. This is gifts from your friends, a gift from family members, gifts, when you get a token plaque at a convention. This includes informational material, which is kind of the exception that was spoken to about attending conferences, but it also includes pamphlets that someone may give out. We're talking, if one of the exceptions is that you receive benefits from the Red Cross because a disaster struck. So I really encourage you, for simplicity's sake, for not having carve-outs of the carve-outs of the carve-outs in the city law, which there are actually is kind of an issue that's presented in the current regime because there's extra limits and no limits and whatever it may be. Just to follow the state gift limits to give a little bit of clarity to what is and isn't a gift. Thank you very much for your time.
David Pilpel again. 3 points. I think Chair Rennie properly called out the constitutional issues that, as I understand it, that you really need to have something that's narrowly tailored. And so limiting or restricting contributions from lobbyists to individuals that they don't lobby or offices that they don't lobby doesn't seem to fall within that. And so finding a way around that makes sense. If someone is lobbying the mayor or the Board of Supervisors and they happen to have a friend running for the school board, I don't see why they should be in a position limiting their contributions to that candidate for the school board. Secondly, this idea that you've discussed it at some length tonight about the state model of identifying who someone is lobbying and restricting activities in that regard. That's, as I understand it, quite different from the way the law currently is structured in San Francisco. So I'm wondering if beyond this particular measure, if the entire regulatory scheme in the city would have to be rewritten and if that would have to go before the Board of Supervisors or if you would include that in this measure, because that sort of, again, as I understand it, changes the way people would register and report. And just thirdly, I think as the previous speaker indicated, I'm not sure that this idea of lobbyists contributing and that's a terribly corrupting influence is as much of a problem as is suggested. Certainly lobbyists can contribute, occasionally do, given our relatively low contribution limits and the considerable expense of running for office. I'm not of the general view that a lobbyist contribution, whether individually or bundled, has the kind of corrupting influence that's been suggested. So I guess in conclusion, I'm sort of thinking that this is kind of a solution in search of a problem. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. We will turn to agenda item 6. Discussion and possible action on proposal by Supervisor Peskin to prohibit city elected officials from establishing candidate-controlled general purposes committee. And maybe Ms. Pelham will explain how this comes before us, and I believe there may be somebody from Supervisor Peskin's office who would like to speak to the issue.
Yes, thanks, Chair Rennie. This is an initiative ordinance that was proposed by Supervisor Peskin on June 14th. There was an earlier ordinance that he introduced on essentially the same topic on June 7th, and it's been referred to us. The supervisor has requested that the commission have this item scheduled for you to take a look at it. There is a staff member here, I believe, from the legislative aid for Supervisor Peskin is here, who can provide some additional background. I think their hope was that the commission would provide some input or recommendations with regard to it, because we have not at the staff level had a chance to do any analysis. That was not included in the item before you, but we did provide the legislative digest in the language as the ordinance was introduced. So I don't know if...
and as I understand it, you had requested that we give you and the staff an opportunity to weigh in and then put it on the agenda for the July 25th meeting. And the concern I had is whether or not that is sufficient time from Supervisor Peskin's point of view to get our view on it, or whether there's some time constraints to deal with it tonight. But we'll hear from the representative of Supervisor Peskin's office.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair Rennie, Commissioners. Director Pelham, thank you for scheduling items 6 and 7 this evening. We'll start with item 6, and I can back up and provide a little bit of context for where this is coming from. So agenda item 6 is, as you stated, Supervisor Peskin's proposal to prohibit elected officials from establishing candidate-controlled general purpose committees, which arises in part out of the 2013-2014 civil grand jury, which referred to this as a significant backdoor for influence by contractors and others seeking city approvals. Our intent with this, we're describing it as a clean government measure, is to essentially tighten up one form of campaign contribution that, in our office's opinion and in the opinion of campaign finance reform advocates whose bodies of work we drew upon here, creates at least a theoretical possibility for the formation of ethically suspect quid pro quo relationships between campaign donors and the elected officials who control these committees. As you know, general purpose committees under the California Government Code may be established to collect money that can ultimately be spent on or for or against any candidate or ballot measure, and it can exist ongoing over unlimited campaign cycles, meaning you can create one of these in 2009 and it can last till 2024 without being attached to any specific ballot measure or candidate. Unlike when someone donates to a specific issue, for instance, in support of or opposing a ballot measure on an affordable housing bond, for instance, or in support of or opposition to a specific candidate's campaign for elected of office, when you're donating here, there's no nexus between the dollar that you are spending and the idea or measure that you're supporting. That nexus is lacking with general purpose committees. And so what you're left with, absent any idea of how your contribution is being spent or for what ends your dollar contribution is furthering, a principal purpose that remains is to create a special relationship with the candidate or elected official who's controlling this committee. And that's essentially the problem that we see and the problem that we're trying to close with this piece of legislation or initiative ordinance, as it may be. Furthermore, because there is no campaign contribution limit on these general purpose committees, what we're essentially allowing for is a loophole to exist that enables candidates to amass campaign war chests to be used as soft money slush funds, all the while circumventing the existing contribution limits, which are, as we know, $500 on candidate committees. So we're grateful to have the support of the Friend of Ethics, who have been supportive since the outset on this, and for the support of Bob Stern, who is known by some as the father of the Political Reform Act in California, and who has spoken eloquently on this issue before this commission last year and in other circumstances. And now, of course, we seek the Ethics Commission's support. And to that end, just a quick procedural note about where we're at. An And unlike item 7, where, we're just here to further a conversation, we would really appreciate the Ethics Commission's endorsement of this legislation tonight. And the reason for that is because it's an amendment to the Campaign Finance Reform Act. This commission must approve the legislation by 4/5 vote of its members before the board can adopt the legislation. So we would have this heard by a committee of the board in mid-July, and ideally have it done by a second reading before the deadline to remove this from the ballot. We're willing to go to the ballot. I think that we have strong support for this at the board, and this can be done legislatively. But of course, we need the support of this body to do so, and I respectfully request that support this evening. And that's about all I have to say on it. I'll stick around and answer any additional questions, but generally looking forward to the conversation on this item. Thank you.
Any commissioners have any questions or comments? Mr. Keene.
I appreciate the staff's suggestion that they'd like to study it further in order to give us a very substantive set of recommendations relating to it. But it is, as was indicated by the speaker, something that we are familiar with. We've heard it from Mr. Stern, and we've heard it from Friends of Ethics, and we've heard it from the civil grand jury. It's something that is indeed a fairly substantial problem and is addressed quite well in regard to Supervisor Peskin's proposed ordinance. And in light of the fact that it is time sensitive, and if we wait until the end of July, I think we mooted out any kind of recommendation that we have. I move that we support it.
Well, I would like to clarify, based on the materials here, the first reading is on July 19th and final action on July 29th. We have a second meeting before that final action. Is that correct?
This is on item 6. Yes.
Yes, item 6.
Right. My understanding is that your next meeting would be at the end of July, and that would not, unfortunately, afford us enough time to go have it heard at a committee of the board before it ultimately needs to be sent to the full board for first reading. The latest, theoretically, that we could be at a first reading before the full board is July 26th, which would allow for this to be read at a second reading on August 2nd. The deadline to remove this from the ballot is 5 p.m. on August 2nd. So that would be cutting it incredibly close. And my concern is that having this heard at the Ethics Commission on July 25th would not allow an opportunity for it to go to committee before going to the full board as it must do.
This proposal is also something that the supervisor intends to put on the ballot if the full board doesn't pass it.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah, and I trust that in light of the support for the ethics measure last year, we would have strong support from the citizenry this year. So that's something that we're willing to do. But I think our strong preference is that we handle this legislatively and do it that way.
I will second motion. Any further discussion on the motion? Public comment on item number 6.
David Pilpel again. As opposed to my previous comment on the last agenda item, I support this. If you pass the motion tonight, that would be great to put the commission in support and allow the board to act. If you're not able to get a unanimous vote tonight, you might want to consider a special meeting in a couple of weeks so that you could act and the board could timely act and hopefully avoid putting this on the ballot where it likely would pass. I think in this case, there really is a problem, that there are at least 2 current officials that have general purpose committees. Others have in the past. This clearly is an opportunity to circumvent limits and obtain access and that sort of thing. And this is a problem that can be fixed legislatively. So I support this measure and support the motion before you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Elena Schmidt, you've already heard that Friends of Ethics strongly supports this, and I'm speaking personally as the foreperson of the 1314 civil grand jury. This was one of the big issues that we had identified, and so I'm glad to see that it's moving forward and urge your support of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Ray Harris, Director, San Francisco Open Government. Aaron Peskin is my representative on the Board of Supervisors, and I strongly support this motion, and I hope you do too. I see no reason to take longer time to look into it. I think you're fairly clear on what it's attempting to achieve. As Mr. Pilpel said, there is an identified problem for which it is being proposed, and I think the sooner it gets clear so that the Board of Supervisors can act without concern, the better.
Thank you. All right. Seeing no other public comment, I will. Yes?
Dr. Derek Kerr, I support this proposal also. I suppose the alternative would be to limit contributions to $500 for these general purpose committees. But either way, banning them totally, which is preferable, or limiting them would show solidarity with people who are not wealthy and people who struggle even to contribute $500. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. Getting rid of these political inequalities is important, and I hope you support this. Thank you.
I will call the question. All in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Record should reflect that it passed 4-0. Turning to item 7, which is also a proposal by Supervisor Peskin, and as I understood his office to say that he wants action on this one tonight, particularly.
Thank you again. This item is less urgent than the prior item for a couple of reasons, but among them that we are still in the process of amending this. This is not simultaneously, there's no motion to put this on the ballot. This is going through the legislative process, and this item I'm genuinely concerned just by just with cultivating a good conversation this evening. I'm happy to provide some context about what we're doing here, if now is a good time for that.
Well, maybe if you could come back at our July meeting when we will have a staff report clarifying the staff's position on it, and if you could come back at that time and we will address the question.
That would be fine.
So it would be my recommendation that we follow the staff's request that they have until the next meeting to prepare an analysis and recommendation to us. Anybody disagree?
I don't disagree, but I would, while you're here, if you could just explain to some extent what the problem is here.
Sure, and I can also sort of outline some of the amendments that we're thinking of that will, further the discourse over the next month as well. So under current law, when a payment of $5,000 or more from a single source is made at the behest of a local elected official for a government or charitable purpose, that official must file a behested payment report. As of right now, that does not apply to the city's various commissions and boards, and we're specifically talking about those that are enumerated in Section 3.1-103, subsection A1 of the Campaign and Governmental Conduct
code. So we do have a very rich commission system in San Francisco, which serves the city in myriad ways. Some of our most critical government functions are performed by the city's commissions and are adjudicated or controlled by the individuals who sit on those bodies. So what this legislation that we're proposing attempts to do is to shed light on the ecosystem of charitable contributions that are solicited by those commissioners. In that sense, this is primarily a transparency measure. Critically, we're not aiming to prohibit the act of soliciting contributions, nor are we attempting to pass any judgment on any commissioner who is involved in raising money for charitable purposes. I think that that's a very common thing that we would, in fact, encourage. To the extent, though, that commissioners or board members are exercising their leverage as public-facing officials to raise funds for X, Y, or Z charitable cause, we do think that it's the public's right to know what that ecosystem looks like. And of course, to the extent that those solicitations are being made to individuals or entities who are coming before a commission or who have come before a commission for whatever cause, be it for an entitlement or otherwise, our office thinks that that information is critical for the public to know. So unlike the previous item, again, we're not seeking approval this evening. I'm happy to have this conversation in more depth in July. I do want to just, the amendments that we're considering first, after consulting with ethics staff, we will be amending the legislation to allow for these reports to be made online or in a form other than the FPPC's Form 803. It would still capture the same information, but would allow some flexibility so that on the one hand, it's easier to report. On the other hand, it's easier for staff to process these reports. Second, we are proposing, or right now, this proposal requires disclosure within 30 days of when a contribution hits that $5,000 limit. In response, we've received from various commissions, we're willing to expand that to a quarterly reporting system, with the caveat that, say, if you are soliciting a contribution from an interested party, we would probably want that disclosed within 30 or 60 days from the time that that contribution is solicited, or the time at the point that it comes to the commissioner's attention that that individual is in fact an interested party coming before the commission. Third, we want to make sure that solicitations don't include things like auctioneering. I think that there are a lot of FPPC letters interpreting what a solicitation is that would be illustrative and instructive here, but want to make sure that that's fairly clear so that our commissioners aren't concerned about activities that are not solicitations. And lastly, and most substantively, we are considering an exception for high-level nonprofit fundraising staff, still looking into how exactly to define that, and I would look to your guidance and expertise in that regard, whether it's executive staff or staff that is compensated for the purpose of performing fundraising activities. We understand that there is an inherent burden in these reporting requirements, and we are interested in minimizing that as much as possible and not really providing a disincentive for people who do sit on or who do work for nonprofits from wanting to serve as commissioners. I think that's a vital pool of individuals who we want to be commissioners in our city, and we don't want to dissuade that. They would still have to report solicitations from interested parties coming before their commission, but in general would not have to disclose every single solicitation they make over the course of their work duties. And that's the long and the short of it. And short of a conversation tonight, looking forward to continuing this conversation in July.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. Could you make this real with a concrete example, or maybe I could ask you a question? So if I were to serve as the class captain for one of my kids' fundraising at school, and were to ask my fellow parents to contribute to the annual fund at school, would that be a solicitation I would have to report if a contribution came in at $5,000?
I think if that fund is a 501c organization, yes, that's the contributions are to 501c organizations. That's what we're getting at. And if it's over $5,000, you would have to disclose that. Correct. Yes.
And what? And so, if the what is the evil that we're trying to prevent here?
Right, and I think that I can be hypothetical in my response there. Suppose you have a commissioner on the Planning Commission, and this may be the most obvious body of a body that grants entitlements that are of high dollar value, and they are soliciting a contribution from someone they know to have a matter coming before the commission for approval of a project or a lot merger or something that requires a conditional use. That solicitation we would want that to be reported. That creates a quid pro quo relationship between the commissioner and the project sponsor who is coming before that commission. And say that commissioner is requesting, hey, well, why don't you just give $10,000 to my kids fund, my school fund, this church organization, this NGO, and we'll see what we can do. I'm not saying that is taking place, but we want to know what that looks like. We want to expose and shed light on that exchange of money.
So I would just suggest if there's a way to more narrowly tailor to get at that kind of behavior, as opposed to having all commissioners need to disclose how much they are trying to fundraise for their children's school. It seems like you cast a very wide net, which is a big consumer of resources, I would think, to go through, for our staff to go through all of that. I understand the purpose of it, but is there a way to work with the director and her staff to come up with something that is can accomplish those goals?
Right.
And
just to that point, I think that's a very good point, and our office is open to suggestion here. There is going to be a learning curve involved with this. That said, this requirement does already apply to elected officials, so we know how it works. We have a tangible system for how it plays out. This would just be expanding the requirement to commissioners, and it does cast a wide net right now. But I think that's in furtherance of the ultimate goal, which is openness and transparency. And there's going to be a lot of reporting that is not suspicious whatsoever. There's no spurious intent to you wanting to raise money for your children's school fund. And yes, it's broad and inclusive of those. But I think that you need to cast a broad net to allow for public scrutiny to reveal some of the complicated relationships that might exist. That said, of course, willing to entertain suggestions, and we have some time to do it.
Following up on Commissioner Chu's concerns, which I think are very legitimate, isn't it important as to who you're asking to give contributions to a 501c? In other words, if you're asking other parents who have nothing to do with any of the work of the commission, as opposed to your planning commission one, where you're going to a contractor or a builder or a developer and saying, why don't you give $10,000 to my son's school? It's much clearer that it's the source who's putting the money up at the request of the public official.
Right.
That is the possibility of a quid pro quo. There's nothing that a parent at the commissioner's school is going to get any favor from the commissioner.
Right. And by the same logic, we could limit the pool of entities or 501cs that are being donated to, which I think is another interesting facet of this, the flip side of the coin. It's not just who you're soliciting money from, but what you're soliciting money for. I think when we begin to narrow it to, say, just soliciting, you only have to disclose your solicitations from interested parties with an item coming before the commission. That actually creates a different type of burden on the person who is subject to that regulation, where now they have to rise to the level of their own level of scrutiny. It's their burden to determine whether a conflict exists there. And I think that deprives the public of being able to provide that scrutiny themselves. Thank you.
I think it's a sense of the four commissioners that this will come back to us in July, but I'll call for public comment.
Hello again. Charles Marsteller for the record. I did want to say that I think the situation has changed in San Francisco on behested payments. Its value is now more appreciated than has been in the past, so that the supervisors are spending a fair amount of time on this, and it's not really clear to the public how much energy has gone into these behested payments and arrangements. I think that just as the state reached a point where it felt it had to deal with those legislators, Mr. Peskin, coming back to the board, now sees that things have changed, and he too has come to that similar conclusion that the state came to must have been 15 or 20 years ago. And I do remember this issue being a state issue in the newspapers. So my suspicion is that, or my suggestion to you is that the easiest way to look at this is a simple disclosure matter. It's just a simple disclosure requirement that he's proposing, so we can get an assessment of the magnitude of the issue, and then look at the data, and if we need to do something, we deal with it then. But I think right now the focus of the bill is simple disclosure. And I don't think you want to really complicate it with the impacts on the sectors that are the beneficiaries of the behested payments or any of that until we really see what's going on. I think that's the first step.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Debbie Lerman from the Human Services Network. I want to speak a little bit as to this exemption around commissioners who are also executive leaders in nonprofits, and just so there's an understanding of why we are having this conversation with Supervisor Peskin's office. We are looking for a narrow exemption for the situation where a commissioner it's also their job responsibility to raise funds for the nonprofit that they work for. And that exemption would not apply if the donor is an interested party with business before that commission. First of all, as Lee Hepner stated, the city does benefit when nonprofit leaders share their expertise through public service on commissions. But donors sometimes request confidentiality, and there are legitimate reasons for that. In our sector, it's somewhat common for donors who are patients or clients and don't want to be outed as somebody who is the recipient of services for mental health or HIV/AIDS, sexual abuse, suicide prevention, domestic violence, substance abuse treatment. So we do see that a lot. Also, just people who have who prefer privacy because of humility, or they don't want other people to know they can afford a donation of that size. They don't want to be harassed for unpopular views. They don't want to be inundated with requests from other people, or they have religious tithing traditions. So donor confidentiality in the nonprofit world is a long-standing tradition, and it is very important to our organizations. If you are a commissioner and you are required to disclose a contribution, you are now placed in a conflict of interest situation if a donor is requesting confidentiality. Do you give up the ability to serve on city commissions and deprive the city of that expertise, or do you create a situation where you're unable to do your job properly in handling those kinds of contributions? As nonprofits with city contracts, we are under tremendous pressure from the city to raise independent funds and augment city funding, and we should not enact laws that hamper the ability to do that by deterring donations. So those are the reasons why we began a dialogue with Supervisor Peskin's office about this issue. Again, we believe it should be narrowly tailored. And frankly, we would have liked to include boards of directors too, because they also raise money for nonprofits. But But as stated, that exemption from disclosure would only apply as long as that donor is not an interested party. And if that donor is an interested party, then you would have to say, I cannot maintain your confidentiality request, and it would have to be disclosed. That transparency would eliminate any concerns of quid pro quo, which is the purpose of the legislation.
David Pilpel again. Few things. I'm not sure if Lee introduced himself. It was Lee Hepner from Supervisor Peskin's office. And in the background on the memo, it refers to the board's Government Accountability Committee. That's actually the Government Audit and Oversight Committee. Perhaps it was just an oversight. As to the proposal, I think this is an interesting idea. To extend this from what's now, 24, 25 elected officials to roughly 800. But in scaling that concept, that requires some effort. It may require some narrowing, as was discussed. I think this would require some staff time, both at the commission, and that should be identified for next month, and within each department or agency to educate on a one-time basis, and then probably annually as part of the Good Government Guide and Sunshine and Ethics training, what obligations members of boards and commissions would have under this proposal. And as Commissioner Chu properly asked, some examples. Well, how does this work if I'm raising funds for my kid's school or some other nonprofit? Some examples of members of boards and commissions that have served as executive directors of nonprofits. Commissioner Andrews, who was on this commission, served as, I think still serves as the head of a nonprofit. Tom Nolan, who's on the MTA board, when appointed was the head of Project Open Hand. I believe Rich Hillis on the Planning Commission is the head of the Fort Mason Foundation. Anyway, and there have been others. So it's not uncommon for the heads of nonprofits to serve as members of boards and commissions. I think the comment was also made that there are members of boards of directors of such entities. And so the point is, having a proposal that is narrow and workable, I think, makes sense. Having disclosure is a good idea generally, but figuring out how to make this work within our complex web in San Francisco will take some time. And so I think having the staff report back next month on the costs and the implications of this and maybe ways to tweak it makes sense. We should probably do some version of this, but we should do so thoughtfully and carefully. Thanks.
Right. We will turn. Shall we take a 10-minute break? Come back at 8:10.
SF Gov TV, San Francisco Government Television.
right, we'll be back in session and turning to item number 8, which is a discussion and possible action on proposed Ethics Commission annual policy plan for fiscal year 2017. And I will ask Ms. Pelham to elaborate, and I would want to say at the outset that I compliment her and congratulate on the job she's done, and I think it's a wonderful proposal.
Well, let's end right there then. Thank you, Chair Rennie. This is an item that was on the agenda originally in April and has been put on hold pending other projects, but it is trying to bring it back to provide a way for the Commission to help structure, to the extent that that's ever possible, a way of looking at policy issues that will be on the agenda for the coming year, and a way to think about how we prioritize, how you prioritize for the staff and the public, the kinds of issues that might be coming that tend to emerge that have more time sensitivity. Specifically, the memo that you have that's dated the 22nd describes the purpose of an annual policy plan really as a foundation for planning and to provide some predictability for the public and interested persons to be able to engage with us in the most effective way possible. So the idea is to try and lay out the comprehensive list of issues that have been pending with the Commission since the last year when you had your discussions in mid-2015 about what policy issues you wanted to see going forward. Also, items that were initiated by others, as well as some items the staff's identified since the beginning of this calendar year. We've included them on this sheet, which is item 8, attachment 1. Some issues that were discussed or touched on in the April memo are shifted here. Questions that were addressed then are shifted here to be kind of guiding principles to consider. So when, in putting items on the agenda and thinking about their sequencing and their prioritization, just trying to identify the most significant areas of policy that are most overdue. Obviously, that comes a lot from some of the civil grand jury reports that have been outstanding. Areas of known policy gaps where there are some risks that really are the greatest that we need to close. Current programs or policies that are most in need of evaluation to identify if effectiveness gaps exist in, are the policies delivering what we think they're intended to? So these items on the middle of page 2 are really trying to establish some ways to think about the principles that would guide, ideally, all things being equal, what does the Commission want to see us coming forward with each year, going forward in terms of a policy, an annual policy plan. The Commission also discussed earlier this year the idea of convening some sort of policy summit to really bring forward forward-looking issues, bring in some thought leaders from the national state scene, our peers at local agencies, to try and identify where we can instill some leading practices to build on the work that we've been doing as we go forward. That's something that this agenda or a policy plan for this year proposes to be following the November election, that we would propose to start delving into that and take a closer look at the experience from November 2016's election and to work with you to put together a policy summit for early 2017 that would provide the basis for a perhaps more comprehensive look at the campaign finance laws in the city, our public financing program, what we might need to do to strengthen any of those. So this, again, the idea would be to help advance the Commission's role as a proactive policy body and an independent policy contributor in the city to the issues that we administer and enforce. To create some predictability to help the public know when they will be engaging at the staff level, on interested persons meetings, and then, of course, at the Commission. But with any plan, flexibility. So this really is meant to be not a static document, but really a living document that might need some amending over time as issues, as you've heard tonight, come before you that require some action because they are more time sensitive than others that we might have identified in advance. So lastly, whether the Commission over time evolves a process that speaks in shorthand of identifying issues that might come forward as, level 1 urgent, something that might be a level 2, or something that might be significant, but not something that you envision prioritizing over the coming year. That's also identified in the report to just see if there's any thought about how you want to consider items going forward when they come forward and how you place them in the sequencing. Attachment 1 is the list broken down by policy areas that you'll see on the left-hand column, and then identification of the policy issues or topics as we understood them to be outstanding or to be on our list currently. And then just some sense from the current fiscal year, what we've been looking at, but also looking forward for the next fiscal year, starting on July 1st, trying to identify roughly when issues might be coming forward, how long they might take at the staff level, a couple of months' worth of items, of discussions before the commission. So this is a starting point. It's not meant to be something that's locked in stone or written in stone at this point, but a way to give you something to react to see if this is helpful in terms of thinking about the policy agenda that you foresee going forward, and in a way to try and put some specificity to the order in which we plan to tackle them, all things being equal in a perfect world. This is also, I will just lastly say that it's premised on the idea that we would be expanding our policy shop beyond the current ranks to expand with the policy analysts that we are foreseeing in the budget beginning in FY17. That's a process of hiring that will be starting immediately in July, assuming that the Board of Supervisors puts the final approval to the mayor's recommendation for our budget. But it is clear that that will take some months to do. So it realistically anticipates having 2 policy analysts in the door probably at the end of this calendar year. That said, there will probably be a couple of items each month that the staff can tackle. But again, as a starting point for discussions for you, wanted to present this to see what your reaction was, what your direction was, and if there's anything that needs to be added or changed, if this is something that you want to move forward with.
Any questions or comments by any of the commissioners?
I agree with you, Chair Rennie, that this is really a fine set of policy proposals. Very good working document for all of us to look at. I want to commend Ms. Pelham, as you did, for its preparation and the level of detail that's in it.
Did you contemplate that this would be every month? This document would be before us as either part of your executive report, so that we could see where we are, if we are moving and meeting these timelines?
Yes, I actually think that's either that placed initially, or ideally even having a policy item separately on the agenda, so that it would enable a fuller discussion about the status of projects, if things need to be moved around, identify generally what's on the horizon. So it wouldn't have to be a lengthy document, but it might be worth, again, depending on your preference. It certainly is important to have it on the agenda, and how we do that will be something that I would imagine would evolve over time. At a minimum, the executive director's report, but perhaps a standalone item that simply says, here's where we are, here are some things on the horizon, and it's an opportunity to then check in and modify as we go along.
I would echo Chair Rennie and Commissioner Keene on the detail and then the structure and the framework laid out here. I think it's very, very helpful, and is a very good blueprint, I think, for FY17 going forward. Question for you on the topics listed in the attachment. Have you given any thought, or would you want to prioritize within here to say, like, what are those areas that would be urgent or actually more priority or significant? I don't want to create work for the sake of creating work, but would that be helpful?
Right. This is to be careful what I asked for. I probably could have put urgency or prioritization numbers on things, which I did not. But if you look at the chart starting in July, based on even this evening's discussion so far, some of the things that were coded as staff level research or analysis, so the items is still the staff level, they're clearly moved to items that would be before the commission. So that means the rest of this next 4 weeks going into that meeting, there's staff work that will be done. But in July, the restrictions, for example, example, the second item under lobbying, the ballot measure would be, of course, before the commission, as well as the Behested donations reporting. We know that will be not staff work, but that would be before the commission as it's shown under ethics, the second line from the bottom. So I guess as you look across the chart, the idea would be that you'll see sort of a wave of items that are coded in blue are things that the staff will be prioritizing, followed by commission's discussions in that order. So you'll see this sort of green when it comes before the commission. Things are not listed in chronological order now because they're broken down by policy area, but it certainly could be sorted or broken down to show a clearer sense of kind of the timeline of what's coming before the commission. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, other than the snapshot as it shows here is kind of the prioritization as I envision it at this moment, again, pending any direction and clarification or modifications from the commission. And that's not something that has to change this evening. That's something that we could work on and modify each month as this item is brought forward. But if you have a sense of the general placement of where these issues are appearing before you, that would be helpful to know as we go forward. Again, it's not something that you have to decide tonight. But one thing, for example, you would see under campaigns, beginning in January, there's a big block of blue, and that's proposing that based on a 2016 report we would do that we're required to do every year following an election, we look at the public financing system, and as we did earlier in March, provide a report to you and to the Board of Supervisors. This envisions that we would take that experience and do a brief report, but that it would be the segue to a much broader analysis of campaign finance issues that would consume really commission's discussion towards the end of this fiscal year coming up. So late next spring, this would envision work coming to you all that talks about campaign finance proposals. And that at the end of next spring, the staff would then also start taking up a more comprehensive look at some of the ethics laws that we have. So that's kind of sequencing those. You can see it sequenced in that order. I think the one other thing that I would note is that what we tried to do is to identify where reports are required under the law. There are some things that the law requires which we would be more specific about as we go forward through 2017, because as you'll note, there was a permit consultant program review report that we are required to send twice a year. We have not yet sent the one from April. This has been one of those priorities that we've not been able to fulfill because of competing issues with limited staff. So that's something that we don't want to repeat. We need to be providing that report as soon as we can, but we also need to keep it on time. So this, I think, would help enable us to see, looking forward, where those kinds of deadlines and requirements are, but then also to be able to manage appropriately where we can spend our policy focus at the staff level and then meeting your expectations as a commission at the commission level.
I just want to say that this is just terrific, and it really is a map for where we are from month to month for us and also for the public to be aware of. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
There's actually a plan, and we can look at it and see where we're going to be at any given time.
All right. Any public comment?
Commissioners Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. In reviewing this proposed policy plan, I failed to find one mention of the Commission's responsibility for enforcement of the Sunshine Ordinance. Thomas Aquinas teaches willful ignorance of what one ought to know is a mortal sin. I would like to say that the Ethics Commission remains knowingly and willfully ignorant of its responsibilities under that ordinance. For years, it has both knowingly and willfully evaded its responsibilities under that ordinance. You spent 2 years farting around, making up an ordinance to take anything referred from the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, and then just basically dismiss all the complaints before you even have a chance to utilize it. I believe its lack of action and ineptitude in carrying out its duties is not only a mortal sin, but knowingly and willfully unlawful. This body does not care what the citizens of San Francisco want in their government by voting for the Sunshine Ordinance and insisting and demanding, in fact, open government and transparency in government. And the repeated constant disclosures of corruption in city government are due largely in part to the inaction of this body and its members. On the whole, I believe this body to be morally deficient and lacking in integrity. This is political theater. It is nothing more, nothing less. And I'm not here as a supplicant like a lot of the people who come before who only can say good things about you because they want something from you. I'm to the point where I know that you're a dishonest bunch as far as the Sunshine Ordinance goes. There has never, in a single case, except Jewel Gomez, been any effort by this body to do anything to enforce that law, even though that law stipulates you are the enforcement body. I do, as I've said earlier, believe that it's because you know you haven't got the ability to enforce it, and you just find it publicly embarrassing, as in the case with Jewel Gomez, when you unanimously recommended the mayor remove her from the Library Commission, and he simply ignored you. The only time the mayor seems to think you're of any value is when he wants to politically go after an opponent like Ross Marakarimi, and we spent millions of dollars and wasted hours and thousands of, you talk about staff time, talk about what we wasted there in doing that. But of course, you do the bidding of those people. You don't hold them accountable.
Thank you.
David Pilpel. Well, I think differently from that, and I say nice things when I think it's warranted, and here I think it's warranted. This is good work. It's not just helpful, but it's colorful. And I think it really does lay out the priorities for the commission and the staff that you've discussed over months, over years, and I, for one, have asked many times that something like this be included in the executive director's report. I think that's a good place for it. For the moment, I would suggest that you adopt this plan tonight with the understanding that it is a living document, and if you put it in the ED's report every month, I think where there's a question that comes up, you could give direction to move things around, and I think it's helpful to see not just where we're going, but recently where we've been. And so I think it really helps in that regard. Just a couple of minor comments in the general area. Somewhere I would add the annual election of commission officers. That's not in here. I think the budget discussion, which is scheduled for January, that often takes 2 meetings. So whether it's December, January, or January, February, I think it's important to block off not just one meeting for that. And I note that some of these items that have been annual items like the audit, there's also a suggestion here that there be a policy and program review following that at some other time. I also think that the flexibility part of this is important because we'll see what particular strengths the new deputy director, policy staff, and other staff bring, and that might, in my opinion, change some of the sequencing a little bit. But in the main, I think this certainly gets us to a better place a year from now, and hopefully with the budget augmentation gives the commission a good place to get to. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chair Rennie, Commissioners, and Executive Director Pelham. I just wanted to say thank you. This document is a wonderful step in the right direction, and it gives everyone an idea as to where this commission is headed and keeping everybody on the same page. So thank you very, very much for you and your staff's hard work, and for you commissioners, too, for all the work that you're doing now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, I wanted to congratulate the executive director and staff for putting this together. I'm sure it took a collective mindset. It's colorful and certainly creative, and I know that you had fun doing it. It's the type of thing that I like. This is the way I think. I have an analytical mind as well, so I can see it reflects an analytical mind or inquiry mode. I did have some items to add, or some wrinkles under bylaws, under general. I hope to raise the question of findings and how important they are. And that gets me to what I was going to address when we discuss the bill that may go on the ballot in November, and that is that the requirements of the Stern proviso or supermajority requirement is that not only you have a supermajority of the board and the commission, but you also have to issue, you have to move in a way that is supportive of the present law and basically furthers the purpose of the act. And in the declaration of findings, it's that device that would be used for that purpose to demonstrate to the public or to speak to the public as to how this reform or this proposal furthers the purposes of the act. And it could be repeal, but more often it's additional law or modification of law, and that's the purpose of it. On auditing, I think there's a lot that needs to be done with auditing. One of them is that we should look at the audit of people that report to the commission when there's particularly interest by other investigatory bodies or authorities, for instance, the FBI or the district attorney or something like that. There was an elected official recently who had several allegedly fundraisers working with him that were implicated and, in fact, indicted. So it might have been, in fact, appropriate for the commission to be auditing that particular elected official at that time. Through best practices, too, we can look at other agencies in the audit business and see what they do that we could maybe improve upon our present practice of doing random audit selection. And I would also suggest under auditing, we look at auto auditing, which is how you can set up subroutines in the program to cross-check the filing of information to make sure everyone is disclosing as appropriate by comparing the numbers in two different types of reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. Elena Schmidt. Just very quickly, under the bylaws review, as I read the calendar, you are doing it this June and this July. And I would just say that there was a discussion 2 or 3 meetings ago when we were pulling the names out of the box for audits, that maybe there needed to be a bylaw review to see if there were other audits that should take place, as in if there were criminal proceedings. So I think that maybe that should be added to that. And I was delighted to see that moving slate mailers is on the agenda. And if I could, Director Pelham, I have a question on your comment that you made about the fact that after in the January timeframe after the election, you would be reporting on the election. There is a requirement, a charter mandated report on the effectiveness of San Francisco's laws. That's what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the clarification. The 2016 report that's actually shown here is specifically the one that refers to the public financing program. Specific to that we report after every election. I think the point that the Friends of Ethics made in an email earlier today was a very useful one. My general view of what an annual report, number one, should look like is exactly what you all have described in your reports. It needs to reflect the impact of the laws and try to give a sense of that. I think that's something also that we're going to be working towards in every report that we produce, not just a statistical analysis, but really trying to provide some context for what those statistics tell us. So I think as we go through over the year, it would be very helpful to be in conversation with a lot of folks who pay attention to our work to make sure that we're hitting the mark work correctly. But that's clearly something we do want to embed in all of our reports, because if people are going to take the time to understand the experience of what we're talking about, they should also have the opportunity to get our sense of what we think that information tells us.
Thanks for the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll move to item number 9, discussion of possible amendment to the Ethics Commission bylaws establishing a process for the Commission to respond to public records requests.
Commissioner,
Sorry, were you not taking action on the previous item?
if I could just clarify, ask the same question. The item is agendized is the Commission can act to adopt an annual policy plan if you want to. Again, it's up to you whether that's something you want to do or if you just,
entertain a motion.
It's not a requirement.
To adopt this.
All right. The motion is to adopt a annual policy plan as spelled out in your recommendation. Is it seconded?
Second.
Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you.
Turning now to the possible amendment to the Ethics Commission bylaw establishing a process for the Commission to respond to public record requests. As a little background, this is sort of a follow-up to discussions that arose that were alluded to earlier by in connection with Mr. Grossman's request that as to what the process should be when a record request is received by the Commission. And the proposal that set forth in 9 would be to adopt as a bylaw that upon receipt of a public records request for documents that may be in the custody of the members of the Commission, the Executive Director must promptly forward any such request to the chairperson as the chairperson deems appropriate in consultation with the Executive Director in the City Attorney's Office. The chairperson may respond on behalf of the Commission. Chairperson may also, in his or her discretion, calendar any such request for the next Commission meeting to allow for further consideration by the entire Commission. I guess the question I have is this all public record requests, or is it public record requests that are directed to either individual commissioners' records or what?
That's for the individual. Yes, it's the latter. That what we were anticipating is that documents that may be in the custody of members of the Commission. So either as an individual member or something that you all may have had as a body.
So give me a illustration.
If we have a public record request for email communications on a particular topic, there may be individual members that have had email communications on those topics and others that may not have, but that's an example of something that may be in the custody of a Commission member. No, I know if it comes through us, but yeah, I think if the idea those requests typically come through the staff, but if there, if there were, I don't know, have you had any other examples?
So, I mean, just as my impression, I guess, of public records requests directed to the Commission is that they usually, as Leanne mentioned, go through the staff and are usually directed to the Commission as a whole. So I actually don't know if there are many instances in which an individual member of the public has directed a particular public records request at a single member of the Commission. It's possible that's occurred, but I don't believe it occurs very often, if that's what your concern was.
Well, I guess what I was subject first came up about 2 years ago was where the executive director made the decision to assert the attorney-client privilege on behalf of the commission. And some of us expressed a concern with saying, you know, how can the executive director make a decision when the commission hasn't even looked at what the documents are that she's asserting an attorney-client privilege on?
Right. So going back to the events from a couple years ago, I don't recall whether I think some of the communications that issued the request were communications between my office and the staff, and some of them were probably also some of the requests probably also addressed communications between my office and the commission.
Right.
And I can't recall in a lot of detail how that breakdown was, whether it's 50-50, more one side or the other. But certainly, you know, this amendment that I worked on with Leanne, you know, this is just a proposal. You know, if the commission does wish to review public records requests and actually review the documents at issue, I mean, that's certainly up to the commission. This was just a starting point for discussion.
I recall quite well what the chair is talking about in regard to the former executive director, and it had outrageous consequences in a number of respects. So to the extent that this does not allow the commission to be bypassed in regard to any kind of information or anything that is requested by either the public or anyone else, or that where a privilege needs to be asserted, the commission should know about it. At least the chair should know about it. So to the extent that this does this, I certainly endorse it.
If I could just ask a follow-up question. So if it's a document that is only in the possession of the staff, so something that has not been transmitted to the commission in any form, and the staff chooses to assert a privilege, including attorney-client privilege, you still want to be informed of that claim of privilege?
I think, yes. I think that any time a claim of privilege is going to be asserted, I don't think the staff member should turn it over, but the staff member should at least consult with the chair as to whether or not a claim of privilege should be asserted. I don't think on a staff level a decision to invoke something like the attorney-client privilege or any privilege should be allowed. I think just in by itself, I think the staff member can then tell the person or the entity or whoever it is who's seeking the information that we'll get back to you, and then at a minimum confer with the chair as to whether or not a privilege should be invoked. But insofar as a staff member having the authority just to invoke an attorney-client privilege, that shouldn't be done. And the one time that I saw that we all knew that it was done, it had horrible consequences for us. It may have been done other times that we don't know about it. Given the past executive director, it probably was. But we shouldn't go down that road again.
Well, when a request comes in for public records, it's directed to the commission, isn't it?
I think it depends on the request. Yeah, they can come in a variety of ways.
Well, do you have public record requests that are directed just to staff members?
Yes, regularly.
All right. And so I think the concern that Commissioner Keene and I were addressing is that to the extent that there's going to be an assertion of some privilege, the commission wants to know about it because it ultimately, the action of the staff impacts the commission, right?
So, yeah, maybe we can take a look at some more. We can take a look at this in light of any other conversation the commission has. We can come back with something this next month that tries to identify that, tries to address that.
Yeah. So, what? Yeah, so just one issue that I would like to flag for the commission is that there are certain kinds of requests that have very strict time limitations. Some requests are what are referred to in the Sunshine Ordinance as immediate disclosure requests, where you need to provide a response essentially within the next business day. So I just want to make the commission aware that there may be instances where there will be some time pressure on perhaps the executive director looping in the chair under such a proposal. Not that it's insurmountable, but I just want to let you know there's some time limitations that come into play.
With respect to those instances where you'd want to seek to assert the privilege.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for there to be an immediate disclosure request and for the staff to invoke privilege with respect to documents that are received. And it could be attorney-client privilege, and it could be other privileges.
And you have a one-day turnaround on those kinds?
3 day, yeah, some for things that are marked under the Sunshine Ordinance, immediate disclosure requests, there's a 24, it's a 1 business day turnaround. For things that are under the California Public Records Act, it's a 10 days, and it can be extended, if there's a need to sort of put together other information or find it, and it's not easily accessible. But I wanted to clarify if I'm misunderstanding the commission, is the concern that you want to make sure that a request that is going to be met with an anticipated assertion of attorney-client privilege, those instances that you want the chair notified of? Or are you suggesting that you need and would want to be notified or have the chair notified any time we're determining that to not turn over records pursuant to a request? Because I think there's a distinction I might have an alternative view about. There are very clear guidelines about what needs to be or can be turned over under a Public Records Act request that doesn't ever involve an attorney-client privilege.
My concern only goes to attorney-client privilege.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I heard you refer to any privileges. Just
Any privilege? What other privileges would you assert? Doctor-patient? Or
no, we would potentially assert official information privilege, whistleblower privileges under the Evidence Code 1040, 1041. It's not uncommon to us to assert that as well.
That's all right. That's fine.
Fine in terms of
in terms of a 1040 assertion. If a staff member can make a determination, I think, on a fairly pro forma basis, whether something is indeed official information under 1040 and assert that privilege. I don't have any problem with that. When you elevate it to the attorney-client privilege, though, I got a big problem with that.
And again, these would be things that have not necessarily been shared with the commission.
Yeah, sure. In terms of 1040.
I'm speaking in terms of the attorney-client privilege.
Say that again?
Yeah, so let's hypothesize that we receive a request, the commission staff receives a request for a document shared between my office and Director Pelham, for example. That may or may not be attorney-client privilege, but if it is, we may invoke the privilege. And are you saying that you want the chair and maybe the commission to be brought into the
Not the commission, just the chair.
Just the chair should just be notified.
That's right.
When Director Pelham hypothetically invokes attorney-client privilege.
Not hypothetically, but actually invokes.
Right, invokes an attorney-client privilege even for communications that has not even reached the commission or the chair at all. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Because in that situation that we had, none of that stuff reached the commission. And then a long time after it came cascading down on us and really had tremendous consequences because we didn't know about it, because no one on the commission knew about it. It's just the executive director going his merry way and asserting privileges in regard, attorney-client privilege in regard to a matter of great import that should have been decided by the commission.
Isn't the requirement that the agency respond within 1 day so a response can be the attorney-client assertion of the privilege, correct?
Correct. And I believe under the proposal that what you and Commissioner Keene are putting forward, the director would notify you if she is invoking the privilege.
Right.
If I hear you correctly.
Before she invokes it.
So.
I mean, it's not a 10.
I guess I'm not clear.
That she would advise the chair that she intends to invoke the attorney-client privilege, and the chair can consult with her
Okay.
And if the chair feels that it wants to bring it before the full commission, it would be, could so advise the requester, saying that the response as to your request on document A and B will be agendized for the next full board.
Right. So I guess I'm not clear. Do you want to be notified, or do you want to have the ability to approve the invocation of privilege?
Well, I would say notified because of the one-day requirement, and the chair may be in who knows where. Okay. I'll take public comment on the proposed draft for the change to the bylaws.
Commissioners, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. I really do take exception to the fact that, except at the very end, your total ignorance of the Sunshine Ordinance, which clearly lays out all these items that you've been discussing, not during the process, but at the very end. As far as an IDR goes, an immediate disclosure request under the law does require a response by the close of business the following day, but that response can include an invocation of a 10-day extension. So basically, there is nothing that why that was presented as, oh, you only have 1 day, when that's not the case. You have 1 day to respond, and that response can be, we need further time to consider what to release and what we may not release. I think sometimes there is probably some confusion about the things that I say to this Ethics Commission, which you have referred in this item yourself. The past executive director played fast and loose with the rules. He just did whatever he wanted. He was like some oriental potentate who sat in his office and just simply decided he wasn't even going to show you something. And I think that's exactly what happened with my complaints that I submitted to you and were reviewed for respectively 32 days and 2 days before a member of your staff simply said, no, we're not going to give Mr. Hartz a hearing. I think they totally usurped your authority. And that's what Mr. St. Croix used to do on a regular basis. But he only did that with the knowledge and permission of then members of the Ethics Commission. It wasn't as if they were dumber than a box of rocks and didn't know he was doing it. And I have questions as to seriously whether he was directed in some cases to do it, so you wouldn't have to deal with unpleasant matters. Like my second complaint had to do with the city library, and all the city library commission members are appointed by the mayor, and so to protect the mayor's ass, you don't want to hear that complaint. In other words, you want to deny me due process. I have a right to a hearing. And the fact that some low-level bureaucrat on your staff can simply deny me that hearing and deny me any possibility of having you actually listen to the facts is egregious. But my whole comment here is the fact that you seem to be working in this vacuum, and the Sunshine Ordinance clearly lays all these things out, and it says any person who possesses a public record is a custodian of record and is subject to disclosure. It doesn't matter whether you're a commission member, a staff member, or anybody. If you have a public record, it's subject to disclosure, and unless you have an exemption that you can cite, you have to disclose it. It goes for all of you, anybody in city government.
Thank you.
David Pilpel, this was the primary reason I came tonight. This is actually an interesting and somewhat dangerous item. I think there's a little confusion about the powers and duties of the commission and the staff in general, and particularly with regard to public records requests. Having served on the task force and being very familiar with the Sunshine Ordinance and the Public Records Act, let me just say this. When a member of the public makes a properly framed public records request, it's up to the head of a department or agency, in this case, Leanne, to either assign it to staff or personally oversee the response and determine whether to produce documents that are held by the agency or invoke an extension or somehow respond in a timely manner. It generally does not involve the commission. The way this original item was characterized, I thought that it involved records that were primarily held by members of the commission, and in that regard, I would say that if you get a letter or an email that you suggest that you believe involves commission business and that was likely sent to a majority of the members, that you should send a copy to the office so that they have it and can respond. If you individually get a single piece of correspondence related to public business and you hold it and not the staff, I'm not sure that that's a public record subject to disclosure. That gets very complicated, and there's a state Supreme Court case that may deal with some of issues about private communication with members of bodies, and since you're non-employee officers of the city, you're in a unique place that's different from employees and staff. But in any event, the general point here is that Leanne has responsibilities to respond on a timely basis, and adding in this notification requirement and potentially some approval authority from the commission with regard to records requests is different and unusual, and not something that I've seen elsewhere in city government, where there's a record requested for which the commission itself holds the privilege because it was a closed session tape or some memo that was given to you in connection with a closed session item. Then I can understand asserting the attorney-client privilege and you having the ability to waive that privilege as you did earlier tonight. But if it's with regard to some document that the staff holds that you've never seen, if there was an attorney-client privilege associated with that document, the director can assert that privilege against disclosure, and that's in his or her sole discretion. It's not an action of the body to overturn that determination. It depends on who holds the privilege and who's the client for purpose of that attorney-client relationship. When the commission has the privilege, you can waive it. When it's the staff, it's headed by the director. Unless you have questions, that's my position. Thanks.
This will be, the proposed bylaw will be on the July calendar. Turning to item 10, the Executive Director's Report. Ms. Pelham.
Thank you, Commission Chair. The Executive Director's Report is under Attachment 10, and I think the most important headline and highlight from this activity, from this report, is the budget. There is, for your reference, a copy of the slides that the staff prepared for delivery at the Budget Committee hearing earlier this month. The Budget Committee determined that for the small departments that had not been the subject of the Budget and Legislative Analyst's report and recommendations, the committee would not be hearing presentations by departments unless the departments chose to. And it was the committee chair indicated that it was the committee's intent to not modify the budgets of those small departments before sending them to the full board of supervisors. And so that is good news, as we were one of the small departments whose budgets was not modified, and again, hoping that when the dust settles, the proposal will be as is. I think there's good indication that that'll happen. But the slides are there. I won't take a lot of your time in the interest of time this evening, but we did walk through, and we did post these on our website so that those who are interested in following the Commission's work and effort this year to really right-size or begin to right-size our budget could see our vision of what our mandate is, what the blueprint is that we've identified going forward for the coming year, what our specific initiatives are, including the e-filing conversion project, and also the recommendation that the Mayor's office has reached to provide a senior fellow to our office in the coming year to help us with our online tools and technology, to make our online experience much more user-focused, much more able to find the information that they need to provide guidance and promote compliance, and as well as the additional resources for our policy focus that we've talked about, and increasing our enforcement resources with 2 additional investigators. One of the things that the summary that we provided to them showed was for each of the project areas that we've identified as priorities, what the positions are, the resources that we have requested and that are being recommended in the mayor's budget, but also the benefits. And when I look at page 6 of the slides, I wanted to point out that when we talk about benefits, those are also things that have translated to key performance indicators, that it's been our commitment throughout this process to ensure that as we go forward, we will be able to demonstrate the investment of those limited, scarce public dollars as translating into significant work and benefits for San Franciscans. So we have those identified for each of the positions. We're finalizing in the next week or so the job descriptions so that we can post them as soon as possible. We are also going to be meeting with the controller who has offered his assistance from his office to assist us with the hiring process, helping to understand and expedite the hiring process where possible. So we're going to be engaged in those conversations in the coming week or so. So that was that's important news, I think, for the Commission, and very good news for us going forward. I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have, or any questions you might have about the Executive Director's report or other items that are going on in the office.
Where do we stand with the Deputy Director?
I have initiated interviews with candidates, and I'm hoping that I'll have more news for you in the coming weeks. It is in process, and so the volume of candidates that we have reviewed applications and have initiated interviews. So I look forward to keeping you informed as there's news to share.
Any commissioners have any questions or comments? Any public comment?
Commissioners, once again, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. The overwhelming stench of corruption in San Francisco is due in a large part to this Ethics Commission's failure to use the resources over the years with which it has been provided. Simply throwing more money at the problem, unfortunately, will, in my opinion, turn out to be simply throwing good money after bad. I hope you prove me wrong in this next statement, but I predict you will actually do less with more. Under one section, you talk about whistleblower protection, which is non-existent. You can look at Dr. Kerr and other members of the public. That law ought to be changed to the protect the citizens, elected officials, and protect the elected officials and government employees from the whistleblowers law. Where at least one city under another section, you discuss the Statement of Economic Interest Disclosure Program, where at least one city department head, Luis Herrera of the San Francisco Public Library, committed perjury year after year after year, and you remain willfully ignorant, and the executive director, the former executive director, simply refused to hear it, and we were forced to take it to the FPPC, which found him in violation. So basically, they said, you were wrong, he did violate the law, and you don't seem to take any interest in that whatsoever. Under investigation and enforcement, we again see Sunshine Ordinance complaints at the same number as it always is, 1. Solitary and alone. Lastly, under the listing for the Bureau of Delinquent Revenues, we see a few small fish you will bully into submission using your power and your attorneys and everything, and the city attorney if necessary, and one big whale which will never see land. You are about as useful as tits on a boar hog. And I always like it when it gets to the point where instead of looking you in the eye, everybody has something else to do, which is more important than listening to the public. The Board of Supervisors is well known for this. They are totally dismissive of public comment. They go off on the side and have little private conversations and everything else. And it basically sends the message to the public, we don't give a damn what you think. And the simple fact that this is the only 2 minutes in an entire week that you ever have a chance to talk to any of us is irrelevant. The public should keep its nose out of the government's business. And very frankly, I think that's how you feel about the public, unless they agree with you.
Thank you.
David Pilpel, 3 points here. I look forward to the policy plan update being included in the Deeds report in the future. I would note on page 2, in the middle, just before the policy and legislation section, the reference to MEA says the Management Employee Association. It's actually the Municipal Executives Association. I try to read what's provided. And lastly, the table showing the summary of pending formal complaints. As we heard, what was it, 2-3 months ago, there's a much larger number of complaints that are still in preliminary review. That was very enlightening when that presentation was made with that number. If it's possible to include in future executive director reports the number in that category of preliminary review, again broken down by type, that's helpful because it really gives us more of a sense in the public of the status of complaints and the workload there. So when some of us are advocating for resources, it's helpful to be able to say there are only 1 or 2 investigators and not just 24 complaints that are pending and formal, but more than that, like 2 or 3 times as many in preliminary review. And so that information is helpful. So if you could ask or if that could be provided in the future, that would be excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
One more question. Actually, I have a couple of questions. First, congratulations on the budget. It looks wonderful, and I'm sure they were impressed with the prepared materials that you submitted on behalf of the Commission. And I have the same question that Mr. Pilpel raised on the real magnitude of the complaints, formal complaints that have been filed before the Commission. I think it is useful to the public to see that you're working much harder than your 24 present number would indicate. Obviously, you have a lot of screening to do. I had a couple of sticky questions. I'm not sure they can be raised or addressed publicly. I don't know. But I'm wondering if the current status of Ms. Sweet and whether that matter has been resolved. That's Lynette Sweet. And the other question I have is whether in the process of the law litigation with Mr. Farrell, whether we automatically have standing for a counter-suit or a counterclaim, probably in dollar terms, for the monies that are in question. I don't know how that occurs.
It was filed. There was a counterclaim filed on behalf of the city.
Very good. I hadn't heard that. So it's been filed. So I know it's going to resolve both items, I hope. And then if you can answer the other one, if not, I can speak privately with the executive director later on. That's regarding Ms. Sweet.
Finish the Sweet case. Didn't we come to a
I thought we did. I thought we did.
Continue. Just to answer your question on the first count, Ms. Marsteller, the July Executive Director's Report will have the updated chart showing the number of matters in preliminary review, as well as the complaints that we had at the previous, a couple of months back. So we'll have that information updated at the next month's meeting for you. I don't know if it's going to be done on a monthly basis, but I could guarantee you it'll be done at least quarterly. It's an honest answer. And the matter that regarding Ms. Sweet that has been in public session because it was in the hearing on the merits it had moved to that stage. The commission had rejected a settlement several months back. That process is moving forward. So I think I'll leave it at that, but it has not stalled.
All right, discussion. Item 11, discussion and possible action on items for future meetings. Any commissioners have any suggestions? Public comment? Additional opportunity for public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda pursuant to the Ethics Commission Bylaw, Article 7, Section 2.
Commissioners Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government. I've been dealing with boards and commissions in this city for the last 8 years after spending 25 years living in Hawaii and getting used to the aloha spirit, which is if you went to someone and pointed to them to the law, they would simply say, well, let me check, and they would come back and say, well, that's what the law says, that's what we'll do. Here in this city, that isn't the way it works. The city attorney, Dennis Herrera, seems to feel that instead of keeping people out of trouble by having them obey the law, what you do is let them break the law and then come up with some sort of specious excuse as to why it wasn't really a violation of the law. Or it would come here to the Ethics Commission and the former executive director was given the latitude to simply dismiss things out of hand, not even letting the commission know what was going on. And you yourself have mentioned that tonight. So part of what you get from me is simply the acknowledgement that there have been years of bad behavior, and it will take a little bit to make up for that rather than simply saying, well, just give us the benefit of the doubt. We've been asked for that, especially as relates to the Sunshine Ordinance, for years. I myself have 24 orders of determination, and each and every one of them was a violation of either my First Amendment rights or my rights under the Public Records Act or the Sunshine Ordinance or the Brown Act. And some of those were multiple violations, and I have yet to have one of them even get a fair hearing. You held one hearing while I was out of state. It was announced the day I left the state, and the hearing was held the day before I got back to the state. Now, if you were me, would you look at a group that did something like that to you? The one party at interest, who Mr. St. Croix himself said, I'm surprised Mr. Hartz isn't here. He's never missed a hearing before. Would you be surprised at all that I don't look at you, Askins, and say, gee, I don't really trust you at all? Now, individually, if the shoe fits, wear it. And I say on at least a couple occasions the shoe does fit, because they were members of the commission when all this was going on, and Mr. St. Croix got away with murder. But the bottom line is, I don't care how you sit there and roll your eyes. I don't care if you sit there and pretend like you're not listening. I don't care if you sit there and stick your head under the desk. I'm going to come here and say the things that I feel need to be said and that others won't say because they're beholden to you and they need your support for things that they want. In fact, the First Amendment, the state constitution, the Brown Act, and the Sunshine Ordinance exist so people like me can come here and say things like this to people like you.
Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.